I remember the heat first, the kind that clings to your neck and settles behind your knees, the kind only a July afternoon in Jacksonville can make. The backyard smelled of charcoal and sweet corn and the salt that drifted in from the St. Johns River. I had barely stepped through the gate before the first round of laughter rolled across the tables, the kind that feels warm if you belong and sharp if you do not. My stepbrother Jake was already in the center of it all, a beer in one hand and that grin on his face, the one he wore whenever he was about to perform. I knew the rhythm by heart. He would tell a story. People would cheer. Someone would ask about his days training at the gym. He would flex or smirk or say something loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. Then, at some point, his eyes would find me and he would strike the match that lit the joke of the day. It always ended the same way, with me smiling so no one knew how deep it cut. But that day felt different before anything even happened. Maybe it was the air or the way the sunlight hit the wooden deck or the way my stomach tightened the moment Jake waved at me like I was an unexpected guest. Captain Lockridge, welcome home. Or should I say, desk captain. The crowd laughed. A few people glanced at me with that polite sympathy older relatives use when they think you have no real achievements. I told myself to breathe. I had learned how to keep my pulse steady in the cockpit of an A-10 while the radio screamed for support. I could keep it steady at a family barbecue. I thought I could anyway. Jake leaned back against the cooler and raised his voice so everyone could hear. I swear she writes reports all day. Paperwork, meetings, nothing like real military discipline. He tapped 2 fingers against his chest the way he always did when he talked about being strong. Being tough, being a man. That word hung in the air longer than the smoke from the grill. I felt every set of eyes slide toward me waiting to see if I would respond. I did what I always did. I lifted my beer. I smiled. Silence was safer. My mother shot me a hopeful glance from the lemonade table as if wishing the moment would pass without sparks. Richard, my stepfather, sat near the back beneath the shade of the old palm tree. 62 years old. Retired Navy SEAL. Broad shoulders. Calm gaze. His face unreadable as always. He kept watching the crowd more than me. That was his way. Quiet. Neutral. Nothing that upset the balance of the family. For years, I thought that neutrality was wisdom. Later, I learned it was another kind of silence that cost more than anyone realized. Jake pushed away from the cooler and swaggered toward me as if he was stepping into a ring. So, Captain, tell us. You got a cool call sign yet, or is that classified too? His tone was mocking. The kind that tells the world you are the punchline. A murmur spread through the tables. Someone whispered she probably does not even have one. I tried to walk past him toward the porch. I wanted the air. I wanted distance. I wanted out before the moment turned ugly. But Jake reached out fast and grabbed my wrist. His fingers closed too tight. I felt the jolt run straight up my arm. It was not violent enough for anyone to gasp, not gentle enough to dismiss. It sat right in that sickening middle ground where people pretend nothing is wrong. A few relatives chuckled like it was harmless fun. My wrist burned under his grip. I pulled back slowly and heard my own voice steady and low. Let go, Jake. He smirked. Or what? You gonna file a report? The laughter came again. I felt it like heat on my skin. For a second, something inside me flickered. Not anger, not fear. Something older. Something heavier. The same pressure I felt years ago in the cockpit when a ground team was pinned and the sun was dropping fast behind the dunes. They had called me sundown over the radio that night. The call sign no one in this yard knew. The call sign that did not belong to the version of me they believed in. Behind the table, I saw Richard stand. Not abruptly, not dramatically. He just rose to his full height and the air seemed to shift with him. Jake, do not talk to her like that. His voice was low, but not soft. A few people straightened in their seats. Jake scoffed. Dad, please. She probably made up half the stuff she tells you. She probably does not even have a real call sign. The yard went quiet, not silent, just tight, waiting, watching. Richard stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine. What is your call sign, Captain? The question dropped like a flare in the night. Bright, exposing. I felt every heartbeat in my chest. I answered because truth deserved air. Even here. Even now. Sundown. Richard froze. His expression changed in a way no one else caught. Recognition. Shock. Gratitude he had never spoken. The truth that had lived between us for 6 long years. He turned sharply toward Jake. The calm in his voice vanished. Apologize. Now. The entire yard fell silent. No laughter. No smirks. Only stunned faces and the weight of a truth that had finally broken the surface. And in that stillness, I realized something. For the first time in my life, my family was seeing me. Not the quiet girl. Not the polite stepdaughter. Not the joke. They were seeing Captain Avery Lockridge. Sundown. The one who had flown through fire. The one they had never truly known. I used to think silence was something you were born with, like the color of your eyes or the curl of your hair, but looking back now, I know it was something I learned slowly and painfully in the years between 2004 and 2010. Jacksonville was hot, even in winter, the kind of heat that clings to the walls of an old house and settles into your clothes. But somehow, the rooms in our home always felt colder when the front door opened and the balance inside shifted. I was 10 the first time my mother told me she was remarrying. She sat me down at the small dining table in our rental house near San Marco, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of sweet tea, her eyes bright with something like hope. His name was Richard, she said, a Navy man, a good man. He made her feel safe. I smiled because that was what daughters were supposed to do. Later that year, Richard Mason moved in with us, bringing the scent of starch and sea salt and the unspoken weight of military precision. He was quiet in a way that made the floors quieter too. Not unkind, not harsh, just steady and unreadable. You could never tell if he was proud or disappointed or thinking of something decades behind him. But the real shift came when Jake entered the picture. He was 2 years older than me, sandy-haired, already broad-shouldered at 12, and he carried himself like gravity bent differently around him. The kind of boy who filled a room just by stepping into it. People liked him without him having to try. Teachers, neighbors, even strangers at the grocery store who complimented his manners or his smile. From the start, it was clear that Jake was the sun and the rest of us were expected to orbit. The first week they moved in, my mother cooked a welcome dinner. I remember sitting beside Jake at the long wooden table Richard brought from his old house in Atlantic Beach. Mom asked him questions about school and soccer and friends. She laughed at every answer. When she turned to me and asked how my day had been, Jake cut in before I even opened my mouth. She read books in the library again. Because she has no friends. He said it lightly, as if he were narrating something factual. The adults laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it was easier than correcting him. I felt my face heat, but I forced myself to smile. That was the first moment I understood that being quiet was easier than defending yourself. Richard never encouraged the teasing, but he never stopped it either. He would sit with his arms folded across his chest, watching, but not intervening. Sometimes he would say Jake enough in a tone that sounded more like a suggestion than a command. Jake interpreted it as permission wrapped in gentle warning. Over time, those small comments became daily rituals. At breakfast before school, Jake would say Avery spilled milk again, even when I had barely touched my glass. During afternoons when Richard was polishing his old seal trident in the garage, Jake would slap the back of my book and say she reads so much because she has nothing else going for her. On weekends, when Mom invited neighbors for a cookout, Jake would imitate my soft voice and people would laugh because they thought it was harmless and cute. Each time, the laughter hit me like a small slap, not enough to bruise, just enough to sting. I would swallow the hurt because crying felt like confirming Jake was right. The strange thing about emotional wounds is how easily they become routine. You stop asking why. You stop expecting fairness. You learn to adapt. I found quiet corners in the house, places where I could exist without attracting attention. Under the staircase where I kept my sketchbooks. On the back porch, steps facing the yard where lizards darted across the fence. In my room where the ceiling fan hummed softly like a warning not to hope for too much. At school, I became the girl who sat near the window and finished assignments early. Teachers described me as polite and reserved. They did not know reserved was just the polished version of invisible. After a while, invisibility becomes a skill. You learn to move without sound. You learn to leave no trace. You learn to breathe without taking space. Jake grew stronger and louder each year. I grew quieter and sharper, but no one ever noticed sharpness when it was wrapped in silence. Mom loved Jake the way people love sunlight after a long storm. He made her laugh and filled the house with noise. She started saying things like, "Boys will be boys," when he teased me. She said he just needed attention and I should be patient. I was patient for so long that patience became a shield I could not put down. Richard was different, not affectionate, not distant, just unreachable. He would nod at me respectfully, but never offered comfort. When Jake and I argued, he stayed neutral, watching with that unreadable expression that made you feel responsible for your own hurt. His silence shaped me more than Jake's teasing ever did. It taught me not to expect help even when someone saw the whole scene. By the time I reached high school, I had mastered the art of holding everything in. I learned to listen instead of speak. I learned to anticipate situations so I could avoid conflict. I learned to build entire walls inside myself without anyone noticing. And somewhere along that path, the belief settled into my bones that keeping quiet was safer than being seen. That belief followed me for years, into adulthood, into the Air Force, into every room where I introduced myself as Avery Lockridge and wondered if people would see me, or just step around me the way my family always had. Those early years in Jacksonville taught me one thing that shaped the rest of my life. Silence protects you until the moment it destroys you. By the spring of 2012, I had reached a point where staying in that house felt less like living and more like shrinking. Every hallway in Jacksonville carried ghosts of conversations where I was talked over or talked about, and every room reminded me of the years I spent learning to fold myself into something small enough not to disrupt anyone. I was 19 when the idea of the Air Force first crossed my mind. It came from a pamphlet on a guidance counselor's desk, glossy and bright, with a photo of a pilot standing beside an A-10 Warthog. The caption said, "Aim higher." I remember staring at that phrase longer than I meant to. Higher felt like something I had never been allowed to reach for. That night, I sat on the back porch listening to cicadas buzz in the humid air while Jake held court inside the house with two of his friends. They were loud and confident and sure of themselves, the way boys were taught to be. I realized then that if I stayed, I would drown under the weight of being someone who existed only in the silent spaces between other people's noise. So, I made a choice. I enlisted in the United States Air Force with nothing more than a suitcase of folded clothes, my acceptance letter, and a heart that knew staying was more dangerous than leaving. Mom cried when I told her not out of pride, but fear. Richard placed a hand on my shoulder and said the Air Force was a respectable path. Jake laughed and asked if they let quiet girls fly planes, or if I was joining to make coffee for real pilots. His words stung, but they also lit something inside me. If there was one thing I understood by then, it was how to turn pain into fuel. Basic training at Lackland tested everything I thought I knew about myself. The first weeks felt like someone had stripped away every layer I had ever used to protect myself. The early mornings, the endless drills, the pressure to keep up. I was not the strongest or the fastest, but I was steady. When others panicked in the heat, I focused on my breath. When they yelled, I stood firm. I learned that resilience was not about being loud or forceful. It was about refusing to break even when you were invisible in a sea of uniforms. During evaluations, one of my instructors paused beside me and said, "Lockridge, you do not talk much, but you do not quit either." That stuck with me longer than it should have. It was the first time an adult saw something other than quiet when they looked at me. After basic came technical training and then the selection process for pilot school. I applied even though the statistics were stacked against women. Everyone knew the unspoken truth. Female pilots had to prove twice as much for half the recognition. Some of the guys joked about it openly, calling us glass birds, because we looked like we would crack under pressure. I carried their jokes the way I carried every slight Jake had ever thrown at me. Not on my shoulders, but in my stride. When the acceptance letter came, I held it in both hands and read it 3 times. I had been chosen for a 10 training. The Warthog, the flying tank, the aircraft built to protect ground teams when everything else failed. It was not glamorous, it was not sleek or flashy. It was dependable and brutal and relentless, and I realized I had been drawn to it for the same reasons I had learned to survive. Training on the A-10 was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Hours in the classroom learning weapons systems, endless simulator sessions that pushed my mind to its edge, real flights that tested my instincts, forcing me to trust myself in ways I never had before. The instructors did not go easy on me. Some doubted me from the moment I stepped onto the tarmac. They questioned my strength, my aptitude, my presence. One of them even said, "You fly too softly, Lockridge. You have to be willing to strike." They did not understand that softness was a choice, not a flaw. Years of swallowing my voice had sharpened a different kind of edge. When it came to the warthog, I was precise, calm, focused. I did not panic. I did not overcorrect. I did not freeze. I found myself in the rhythm of the cockpit, the hum of engines, the weight of the controls, the steady pulse of my own heartbeat syncing with the aircraft. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like my silence was not a weakness but a discipline, a strength. By Tune 14, I had earned my wings and my slot in a Warthog squadron at Moody Air Force Base. The day I stepped onto the flight line wearing my new name patch, I felt something inside me shift. Pride, maybe, or recognition. I was no longer the quiet girl in the corner of a Jacksonville living room. I was part of something bigger, something that demanded everything of me and gave purpose in return. In those years, I did not hear much from my family. A few short calls from Mom, a couple of indifferent messages from Richard. Jake never reached out. It was better that way. The distance gave me room to grow, room to breathe, room to become the kind of person I never could have been under the shadow of their expectations. The Air Force did not teach me how to be loud. It taught me how to be strong. It taught me discipline and clarity and the kind of courage that builds itself quietly, mission after mission, hour after hour in the open sky. It taught me something else too. Silence can be an armor, but only until the day you decide to take the sky back. I came home for the first time in 2015, a few days before Thanksgiving, when the air in Jacksonville finally softened from the heavy heat of summer into something almost gentle. Moody Air Force Base had granted me leave, and despite the knot in my stomach, I told myself it was time. Time to show my family the version of me they had never taken seriously. Time to see whether distance had changed anything. As I pulled up to the familiar driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered. The white paint had faded into a dull cream, and the palm tree out front swayed slowly in the afternoon breeze. I sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, reminding myself that I was no longer the girl who whispered her way through rooms. I was an Air Force pilot with wings sewn onto my chest. I had flown an aircraft most people only saw in documentaries. I had survived training that broke stronger people. None of that should have needed to be said out loud, but something inside me felt fragile as I walked up the steps. Mom opened the door before I could knock. "Avery, you're home." She hugged me tightly, smelling of vanilla lotion and old memories. When she pulled back, her eyes scanned me with pride, tinged by disbelief, as if my uniform alone were a costume rather than a career. Richard appeared behind her, tall and reserved as always. His face barely shifted, though I caught a flicker of recognition when his gaze settled on my flight patch. He nodded once. "Good to see you home, Avery." His voice was calm, but distant like always. Jake arrived a beat later, pushing through the door with the same force he carried into every room. 23 now built like a billboard for the local gym. Shoulders wide, jaw sharp, the kind of body people praised without noticing what sat behind the surface. He looked me up and down the way someone inspects a car with a dent they pretend not to see. "Look at you," he said. "Tiny Captain Lockridge." His grin widened. "Do they even let you lift anything heavier than your helmet?" Mom let out a small laugh, the nervous kind that tries to smooth tension before it rises. Jake flexed one arm playfully, and two of his buddies lounging near the couch chuckled in response. They were the type of men who believed muscle alone proved value. Jake lived in that belief like it was gospel. I set my duffel down and forced a smile. "Good to see you too, Jake." He shrugged. "I mean, good for you if flying is your thing. Just different from real physical discipline, you know." His buddies nodded as if he were teaching a lesson. I felt the familiar burn low in my chest but swallowed it. Picking a fight now would only turn the holiday into another arena I had not asked for. Mom tugged me toward the kitchen, chattering about food and relatives and who was coming by for dinner. I moved through the house like a visitor rather than someone returning home. Every corner carried a memory, but none of them belonged to the person I had become. The table was already set for the holiday meal. Silverware aligned perfectly, a bowl of cranberry sauce still warm, a platter of turkey resting under foil. Richard carved slices carefully while Jake hovered nearby, offering unsolicited comments about portion sizes and protein intake. When I reached for the mashed potatoes, Jake smirked. "Careful, Captain. Would not want to strain your arm." One of his friends snickered. I let the comment pass, but Richard's knife paused mid-slice. He did not say anything. He never did, ever. Keeping the peace was his silent doctrine. If Jake was the storm, he was the still water beneath it, but still water can drown too. We sat down to eat and conversations flowed around me like currents I could not step into. Jake talked about gym milestones, his deadlift numbers, his new role as an assistant trainer. His friends chimed in enthusiastically. Mom asked him questions as if he were being interviewed for a magazine. When she finally turned to me, her smile was polite. "So, how is flying, honey?" Her tone held none of the curiosity she offered Jake. I answered softly, "Good. Busy." She nodded and moved on before I could say more. Richard listened without meeting my eyes. I realized then that my life in the Air Force existed outside their mental map of success. Their world revolved around Jake, and no matter what I achieved, it seemed I existed in the margins of their conversations. After dinner, we gathered in the living room. The television played a football game, but no one watched. Jake performed small shows of strength, lifting one end of the couch or doing push-ups while joking. Each stunt earned laughter and praise. No one asked about my squadron or my training or the hours I spent in the cockpit. I could have vanished and the night would have gone on the same. At one point, Jake dropped onto the couch beside me and nudged my shoulder a little too hard. "Must be weird being back," he said. "All those jets and now you are here doing nothing." His tone held that familiar mix of mockery and confidence. I looked at him for a long moment, long enough for him to notice something different behind my eyes. Maybe he saw strength rather than silence. Maybe he saw the edge I had spent years honing. Maybe he felt a shift he could not name. But before anything could settle, Richard cleared his throat and asked if anyone wanted pie, an interruption disguised as hospitality. The night wound down. People left. The house quieted. I stood by the front door as Mom hugged me goodbye. "I am so glad you are doing well," she said, though the words felt thin. When I stepped outside, the air was cool against my face. I walked to my car, feeling the hollowness settle back into the spaces I thought I had outgrown. I had returned hoping for recognition or even acknowledgement, but all I found was the same truth I had left behind. In this house, I was still invisible, and no matter how loud engines roared under my wings, the silence here remained heavier. By the time 2019 arrived, I had been with my squadron long enough to understand the rhythm of deployments, the way time stretched and tightened depending on the mission ahead. January found us forward deployed near the Syrian border, the air thick with dust that clung to everything, even the inside of your lungs. The briefings grew sharper each morning, our maps marked with new threats as cities shifted hands. I had flown dozens of sorties by then, close air support runs that demanded precision and calm, but nothing prepared me for the night that would define everything that came after. We received the call just after dusk. The sun had slipped behind the horizon, leaving a thin red line across the desert, the kind of fading light pilots measure instinctively. Sundown approaching my lead, said as we suited up, using the phrase that had become half warning, half omen. The radio crackled before we even taxied. A SEAL team was pinned in a narrow valley near Raqqa, caught in an ambush while extracting an informant. Their convoy had been hit, communications scrambled, and enemy fighters were closing in from both ridges. The request for close air support came through urgent and clipped the kind of tone that leaves no space for hesitation. When I climbed into the cockpit, I felt the familiar steadiness settle into my bones. The A-10 hummed beneath me like an old friend waking from sleep, and I knew whatever waited out there, I had the aircraft to meet it. We were airborne in minutes, heading toward the coordinates flashing across the HUD. The desert below was a sheet of shifting shadows. As we approached the valley, ground fire lit up like sparks from a broken wire. The SEAL team's voices cut through the static tents but controlled. Eagle 1, we are taking heavy fire from the northern ridge. We need eyes. We need air. My jaw tightened as I recognized the cadence. Slow, commanding. It was not the voice I knew from Jacksonville living rooms softened by polite conversations. It was sharper, honed by decades of combat. It was Richard. For a moment my breath caught, but training overrode instinct. This was not the time for shock or memory. This was the time for precision. I dropped altitude scanning for muzzle flashes. Thermal signatures lit up across both ridges. At least 24 enemy fighters moving in a loose arc, cutting off the team's exit. My lead cleared me for the first run. Sundown, you are up. Make it count. I rolled the Warthog into a tight bank, the cockpit tilting as the valley snapped into view beneath me. The world narrowed into 2 coordinates and the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. The 30-meter cannon roared, a deep mechanical thunder that shook through the airframe. The rounds struck the ridge in a controlled sweep, scattering fighters and breaking their line. The radio erupted with renewed urgency. Southern ridge shifting. They are flanking. I adjusted, lined up for the second run, and felt the familiar calm settle like a second skin. I sent another burst, downrange dust exploding into plumes that swallowed the enemy's position. My wingman cleared the other side. Between us, we carved enough space for the SEALs to reposition around their wounded. But the fight was not done. When the team began their extraction toward the eastern route, a hidden mortar team opened fire. The first round hit close enough that I felt the shockwave through the cockpit even from altitude. The team's radio went sharp. They will not make it without cover. My fuel calculations flashed in my mind. I had enough for 1 extended run, maybe 2 if the winds cooperated. Lead gave me the go. Sundown, take the long arc. Keep them alive. I pushed the throttle forward and dove lower, threading the aircraft between the ridges. Machine gun fire arced upward, catching the wing with a metallic thud. I ignored it, focusing on the mortar team setting up for another round. One squeeze of the trigger split the earth beside them and silenced the position before they could fire again. Seconds later, the SEALs broke through the choke point, moving fast with their injured slung between them. Their voices came through breathless but steady. Copy air support. We have movement. We are clear. As they reached safer ground, a rush of relief swept through me, so intense my hands shook for a moment on the controls. Lead called the extraction complete and ordered us to return to base. My fuel warning blinked just as the base lights came into view. We landed without ceremony, though every muscle in my body trembled as I climbed from the cockpit. I heard the debrief before I stepped into the tent. The SEAL team had made it back with only minor injuries. The CO said the close air support had prevented a full loss. 2 hours later, he approached me privately. Lockridge, that team owes you their lives. His tone softened as he added one more sentence. Their captain knows who you are. I froze. Richard. The man who rarely looked at me long enough to see past my silence. The man whose son treated me like a footnote. The man who never once asked about my training. He knew. He had heard my voice over the radio. He had fought for his life with my call sign echoing through the valley. The next morning, a sealed report arrived. Classified. Mission details restricted. Names omitted. Only the call sign Sundown listed in cold ink. No wide recognition. No ceremony. No story to bring home. That was the rule. The mission was locked behind clearance levels none of my family would ever access. I carried the truth quietly like everything else I had carried for years. But something changed that night in Raqqa. In the valley where gunfire tore the air apart and the sun sank behind the dunes, I had not been invisible. I had been decisive. I had been necessary. I had been seen, even if no one at home would ever know. When we returned from Syria, the days blurred together in a haze of debriefings, maintenance checks, and the quiet hum of routine that always follows a mission with too much weight. The desert dust clung to our boots even after we scrubbed them clean, as if the air itself wanted to remind us what we had survived. I told myself I was fine. I told myself I had done my job, but something lingered in the back of my mind, a question I could not name but felt with every breath. 3 days after the Valley firefight, my commanding officer called me into his office. He rarely summoned pilots individually unless there was a problem or something classified required verbal instruction. I stepped inside and stood at attention, waiting for whatever he needed to say. "At ease, Lockridge." His voice carried that steady tone commanders use when the truth behind their words matters more than the volume. "You should know. That SEAL team you covered, their captain requested a follow-up on the pilots who flew support." My pulse caught. I forced my expression still. My CO studied me for a long moment before adding, "He recognized your voice. You kept them alive. He is aware of that." He did not have to say Richard's name. I heard it anyway, echoing in the space between us. I nodded slowly. "Understood, sir." My CO's jaw tightened slightly. He went on, "You will not receive formal credit. You know how that works. Classified mission. SEALs operate under heavy blackout. Our involvement stays off record." He hesitated before continuing Lockridge. "He knows. He wanted you to know he knows." That last part stayed with me. Wanted you to know. A strange, bitter warmth rose in my chest. Gratitude, maybe. Or disappointment. I could not tell which. When I left the office, I walked the length of the tarmac alone. Jets shimmered in the heat, their metal skins reflecting the hard afternoon sun. The Warthog sat heavy and grounded, its engine silent, but its presence still pulsing through me. Somewhere across the globe, Richard was breathing because of a choice I made in the sky. But there were no calls, no emails, no messages from Jacksonville. Just silence. The kind of silence I knew too well. A few weeks later, our deployment ended. We flew home in groups and were greeted by the familiar rhythms of base life. Families lined the fences holding signs and waving flags as pilots and crew stepped off the transport planes. Children cheered. Spouses ran into open arms. I watched from a distance, duffel slung over my shoulder. I had no one waiting at the gate. That was normal for me. Expected. I did not cry, but something inside me tightened like a fist. When I finally got back to my dorm room, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at my phone. I told myself I did not care. I told myself Richard's silence made sense. Classified missions were never discussed. SEALs had their own rules of acknowledgement. Gratitude stayed behind locked doors. But logic and emotion rarely obey the same laws. Part of me wanted to hear his voice. Just once. A simple, "I know what you did." A simple thank you. Even a quiet acknowledgement hidden inside a sentence about something else. Anything. But nothing came. Weeks passed. The world moved on as if the Valley in Raqqa had never happened. My squadron returned to regular training cycles. Jake posted new gym selfies on social media. Mom shared photos of dinners and quiet weekends. Richard appeared in 2 pictures standing behind the grill or helping repaint the porch. His face calm, steady, unchanged. No one asked about my deployment. No one asked if I was safe. No one even knew how close they had come to losing the man they praised so often. I began to realize something harsh. Richard was comfortable with the version of me that stayed quiet. The version who blended into the corners. The version who took up as little space as possible. Recognizing me publicly would disrupt the balance the family had built for years. Acknowledging what I did would require him to admit that I had grown into something beyond what they expected, beyond what they valued. That truth sat heavy in my chest. I had saved his team. I had saved him. And yet in my own family's story, I was still a background character. I was still the quiet girl who read too much, the one who supposedly lacked real discipline, the one Jake mocked at every holiday. Even though Richard had heard my voice over the radio, even though he had trusted my judgment when the world was falling apart around him, even though my call sign Sundown had been the difference between life and death, his silence did not feel like neutrality anymore. It felt like erasure, like he had taken the truth and locked it away because facing it would mean facing everything they had done to make me feel small. That realization hit harder than any mission ever had. I carried the weight of it into every flight, every briefing, every moment when my name crackled through the radio. Some nights I lay awake hearing the echoes of the SEALs shouting for help, the thud of gunfire, the tremor in Richard's voice when he recognized mine. I knew he remembered. The CO said SEALs never forget debts like those. But remembering silently and acknowledging openly were two very different things. By summer of 2019, I understood something painful but necessary. My family wanted the myth of Richard the Unbreakable SEAL and Jake the Golden Son. That myth only worked if my part stayed invisible, so he chose to keep my name in the shadows, and I chose to carry that truth alone. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself recognition was not the point. But deep down, I felt the fracture, a wound beneath the skin that would not heal quietly. That unspoken truth became the foundation for everything that would follow. The breaking, the confrontation, the moment at the BBQ years later when I finally refused to stay silent. The eruption did not start in 2025. It started in the valley in Raqqa. It started the moment Richard chose quiet over truth. It started the moment I realized I had saved his life and he chose to pretend I had never been there at all. The years between 2020 and 2023 passed the way long deployments often do, in a blur of orders, rotations, short nights, and skies that never looked the same twice. My life became a cycle of flight schedules, maintenance briefs, and missions that required more focus than emotion. It was easier that way. Work kept my mind sharp, and the cockpit gave me a sense of control that my family never had. There is something steady about the hum of an A-10 something, grounding in the way the aircraft responds when you trust it fully. Up there, I was not invisible. I was essential, necessary, clear. But every time I returned to base after a mission and checked my phone, the silence from home followed me like a shadow. No messages asking whether I was safe. No mentions of my deployments. Not even a casual, "How are you?" from Jake or Richard. It was as if my life existed on a separate plane altogether. No one in Jacksonville bothered to look toward. Meanwhile, Jake's presence online and in the family thread grew louder than ever. Mom would send photos of him flexing outside the gym with captions like, "Your brother is so dedicated," or "Jake is becoming such a strong young man." She said it proudly, as if strength could only be measured in muscle, as if discipline lived only in the weight a man could lift. Jake had reinvented himself during those years. After dropping out of community college, he took a job at a local gym, then another, and eventually became a trainer. His social media was filled with motivational quotes, shirtless photos, and videos of him explaining the difference between real strength and the kind you only get from book learning. He never missed an opportunity to remind the world that he was tough, that he was disciplined, that he worked harder than anyone else around him. And slowly, my family absorbed every word he said. They shared his posts. They praised his commitment. They treated him like a local celebrity. Meanwhile, when I sent home photos from deployments, Mom would respond with a thumbs up or a simple, "Be careful, honey." The difference was unmistakable. In early 2021, Mom called me during one of my short stateside breaks. Her voice was cheerful. "Jake is teaching a new self-defense class. You should see how confident he is." I hesitated before answering. "That is good for him, Mom." She went on as if my tone meant nothing. "He says it is funny you work in the military but never do anything physical. He says you probably push papers all day." The words stung, even though they did not surprise me. Jake had been saying versions of that since we were teenagers. Back then, it had been childish teasing. Now it was public commentary. By 2022, it became a full-blown narrative. He told extended relatives that Air Force pilots were basically overpaid gamers. He joked at gatherings that I probably sat in a room with 3 monitors pretending to fly. He called me a computer pilot, the kind who looks tough only because of the uniform. At first, I brushed it off, but then relatives began repeating his words. "Your brother says it is not like the movies. You probably do more typing than flying." Or, "Avery, sweetie, your job is safe though, right?" "Nothing dangerous." I learned to keep my answers short because explaining myself felt like begging to be believed. Jake did not attack me with cruelty. He did it with confidence. The kind of confidence that convinces people you must be exaggerating your own achievements. It did not help that I could never talk about most of my missions. Classified was not a word families liked to hear. They assumed it meant unimportant or administrative. Jake leaned into that assumption and built himself into the authority on what counted as real military service. At one point, a cousin even told me Jake says the Air Force is basically corporate with jets. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the ignorance was so deep I did not know where to start. Throughout those years, Richard remained the same. Quiet, neutral, unmoved. Whenever family members praised Jake's strength or discipline, Richard would nod in approval. When Jake made comments about my job being soft or technical, Richard did not correct him. He did not say a word about Syria. He did not say a word about the night I saved his team. He just stayed silent, and because he was a SEAL veteran whose presence everyone respected, that silence carried weight. If Richard did not disagree, Jake must be right. That unspoken logic settled over the family like a fog. I noticed it each time Mom spoke. She would tell me proudly that Jake was training for a new competition or helping elderly clients at the gym or building online following. When I mentioned a mission, she would go quiet for a moment, then pivot to something about Jake's latest achievement. It was not jealousy. It was blindness. A blindness she never tried to correct. I told myself it did not matter, that I did not need their validation. But sometimes after long hours in the cockpit, when the adrenaline faded and the isolation crept in, I felt the old familiar ache. The ache of being unseen by the people who should have known me best. The ache of knowing one boy's ego could overshadow years of sacrifice. The ache of realizing that truth meant nothing if the loudest person in the room insisted otherwise. By late 2023, Jake had molded himself into the family's golden pillar, their symbol of perseverance, their measure of strength, and every time he dismissed my work, they believed him a little more. I was not angry. Not yet. I was tired of their willful blindness, tired of the story they chose to tell, tired of carrying the truth alone. That fatigue would eventually turn into something sharper, something stronger, something ready to rupture the story they built around Jake. But that reckoning would not come until the summer of 2025. For now, all I could do was endure the years of silence while Jake's voice grew louder and louder and louder. I came home again in the spring of 2024, long before the barbecue that would shatter the silence for good. The reason this time was not a holiday or an obligatory visit. Mom had fallen ill after a sudden infection turned into a more complicated condition, and though she insisted she was fine, the tremor in her voice told me otherwise. I put in leave the moment my CO approved it and drove straight from Pensacola to Jacksonville, arriving just as the sun dipped behind the St. Johns River. The house looked the same from the outside, but the air inside felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were bracing for something they could not name. I found Mom sitting on the couch wrapped in a blanket. Her face brightened when she saw me. "Avery, honey, you didn't have to rush." I sat beside her and took her hand. "Of course I did, Mom." Jake stood near the hallway, arms crossed over his chest, looking at me the way someone looks at an old acquaintance rather than a sibling. He had bulked up even more since I last saw him, the muscles in his arms stretching his t-shirt. He didn't smile. "Figures you show up now," he said. The words landed like a stone, dropped into still water. I held his gaze. "What is that supposed to mean?" He shrugged with exaggerated nonchalance. "Just saying we have been dealing with this for days. Mom's appointments, hospital visits, medication tracking. And you suddenly appear acting like you care more than we do." Mom closed her eyes briefly as if bracing for impact. "Jake, please, not now." But Jake had always been the type who grew louder when he felt insecure. He stepped closer. "You're never around Avery. You fly off to who knows where and then drop in when things get serious so you can feel like a hero." I felt a slow pulse of anger rise but kept my voice calm. "I was deployed, Jake. I came as soon as I could." He scoffed. "Yeah, deployed. Sitting in front of screens or whatever it is you actually do. Mom's been sick and we're the ones taking care of her." His tone made it sound like he was accusing me of a crime. The worst part was the flash of guilt in Mom's eyes, even though she knew better. Richard entered the room then. He had aged since 2019, more gray in his beard, more tired in his posture, but his presence still carried that quiet weight. "Enough, Jake," he said. "She's here now." Jake threw his hands up. "I'm just telling the truth." Suddenly, Avery shows up and everyone acts like she's the only responsible one. He looked at me then with something sharper than resentment. A need to feel superior. A need to reclaim the center of the room. Mom squeezed my hand. "Jake, please, your sister is helping by being here." He muttered something under his breath but backed off a few steps. Richard tried to bridge the widening gap with the same diplomacy he had used for years. "Jake's just stressed Avery. We all are. Don't take it to heart." The familiar numbness settled in my stomach. That tone of his. The same one he used when he wanted tension to dissolve without addressing the cause. I had heard it since childhood. The tone that asked me to swallow the hurt for the sake of peace. The tone that always left Jake untouched. I nodded once because arguing with Richard never changed anything. Instead, I helped Mom to her bedroom and made sure she took her medication. She smiled at me weakly. "I'm glad you're home, sweet girl." I tucked the blanket around her shoulders. "Rest, Mom. I'll take care of things." When I stepped back into the hallway, I found Jake leaning against the wall watching me. His voice was low. "You think you're the hero coming in here last minute, but you're not. Some people actually stay." I folded my arms. "I didn't know I needed your permission to love my mother." He pushed off the wall, closing the distance between us. "You don't get it, Avery. You just show up in uniform thinking that makes you better. You think flying makes your life harder than ours. You don't know what real responsibility looks like." The accusation wasn't new, but the bitterness behind it was sharper than before. I held his stare. "I never said I was better, Jake. I said I came home because Mom needed me. That's all." He opened his mouth again, but Richard appeared behind him. "Jake, enough." His voice had more firmness than usual, but not enough to stop Jake completely. Jake threw me a final glare before stomping off toward the kitchen. Richard stayed behind for a moment. He rubbed the back of his neck the way he did when he felt guilty. He didn't apologize. He didn't address the unfairness. He just said, "We're all tired, Avery. Let's try to keep the peace for your mother's sake." I swallowed the familiar ache. The peace he wanted always came at my expense. That evening, I made dinner while Mom rested. Jake stayed in his room, the music from his weights clanking through the walls. Richard sat at the kitchen table reading a worn seal memoir he'd never let anyone else touch. The silence between us felt heavy, but not hostile. Just unresolved. After dinner, I stepped outside to breathe the cool night air. Jacksonville's spring was humid and thick with the smell of the river. The porch light cast a soft glow around me. I thought about Syria, about the night Richard's voice broke through the static, about how quickly truth could be buried when no one wanted to disturb the family story. I realized then that the tension in the house was not new. It had always been waiting beneath the surface. The resentment Jake carried, the guilt Richard refused to name, the quiet role I was expected to play. That night, as I lay on the couch listening to the house settle around me, I felt something shift inside. A warning, a flash, a knowing. The conflict was no longer simmering, it was building, and soon it would boil over. The confrontation that would change everything came quietly the way storms often do in Florida, gathering heat in the air, long before a drop of rain ever falls. It was October 2024. One of those nights when the humidity clung to the walls and the silence inside the house felt stretched too thin. Mom had already gone to bed exhausted from another day of medications and appointments. Richard was outside on the porch cleaning the old grill, pretending not to notice the tension that had been building since my arrival. I was in the kitchen rinsing dishes, grateful for the momentary calm, when I felt someone step into the doorway behind me. Jake. I sensed him before I turned the way you sense a storm forming behind your shoulder. He stood with his arms folded, blocking the only exit, his expression twisted into something halfway between smugness and accusation. "You think you can just show up and take over," he said. His voice was low, almost too calm. I set the plate down slowly. "I wasn't taking over anything, Jake. I was helping Mom. His jaw flexed. Helping? Right. The word sounded like an insult the way he said it. You disappear for years. Then you come home and act like you care more than the people who actually stay here. I dried my hands on a towel. I care because she's my mother, just like she's yours. His eyes narrowed, the muscles in his neck tensing. Don't pretend we're the same Avery. You have no idea what real responsibility looks like. You fly around doing whatever you do, pressing buttons in a cockpit, posting pictures in uniform. Meanwhile, I'm here, day after day, doing the work. The ignorance in his voice was so familiar I could have recited it with him, but something inside me had changed. Maybe it was all the years of missions he knew nothing about. Maybe it was the weight of the truth I carried alone. Or maybe it was simply that I was tired. Tired of shrinking. Tired of silence. Tired of bending so he never had to. I stepped closer. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. I just stood tall the way the Air Force had taught me, the way survival had taught me long before that. You don't know anything about my job, Jake. You don't know what I've done. You don't know what I've carried. He scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically. Oh, here we go. The war hero routine. What's next? You gonna tell me you're saving the world? You think wearing that uniform makes you better than us? I shook my head. I've never said that. He leaned in, then close enough that I could smell the mix of sweat and cologne, close enough that I could see the fury flickering in his eyes like something unstable. Don't test me, Avery. You think just because Richard likes you in that uniform, you can walk in and talk like you matter. I blinked once, slowly. He kept going. Dad's been carrying this family for years while you play pilot somewhere, and now you stroll in acting like you're the hero. Let me be clear, you're not. For the first time in our lives, I didn't look away. I didn't drop my gaze. I didn't shrink. I stood up straighter, shoulders, squared feet, planted every inch of me carved from the years I spent earning something real. Stop calling him your dad, Jake. The words left my mouth before I processed them fully. He froze, his eyebrows pulled together sharply. Excuse me, Richard isn't your dad either. He's just the only man who ever told you no, and you've been trying to prove yourself ever since. Something snapped in his expression. His voice dropped into a growl. Don't talk about him like you understand anything. I raised my chin slightly. I understand more than you think. He stepped closer, invading the last inch of space between us. You think you're tough, he whispered. You're not. You think you're stronger now. You're not. You think you can challenge me. Don't. The word hung in the air. A warning, a threat, a push against the thin line between confrontation and something darker. But I didn't move. I didn't back down. I held his eyes with a steadiness I had never allowed myself before. Try me. His breath hitched. The bravado slipped for half a second, revealing something raw and unsettled under the surface. He hadn't expected resistance. He had expected the quiet girl, the one who stepped aside, the one who folded. But she was gone. The silence between us thickened until the air felt sharp enough to cut. Then a voice cut through it. Jake! Richard stood in the doorway to the porch, his face shadowed but his posture rigid. Step back. Jake looked at him, jaw-clenched frustration tightening his features. We're talking. Step back. Richard repeated firmer now. Jake hesitated but took one reluctant step away from me. Not far? Just enough. Then he pointed at me, his finger trembling with anger. This isn't over, Avery. Not even close. I straightened. Good. Because I'm done pretending. He stormed out of the kitchen, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. Richard lingered for a moment. He didn't come closer. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't reprimand Jake or acknowledge what had just happened. He simply rubbed his forehead and sighed. You two need to be careful. Your mother doesn't need this stress. Then he turned and walked out. The quiet that followed was suffocating. I stood there with my hands braced on the counter, feeling the tremor that ran through me, not from fear, but from the rush of finally standing my ground after years of swallowing every word. That night, I lay awake listening to the distant sound of Jake's weights slamming against the floor. Each thud felt like a promise. Or a warning. The confrontation in that kitchen hadn't resolved anything. It had cracked something open, something that would only widen, something that would lead straight into the fire of the summer barbecue when everything we had avoided would finally erupt in front of everyone. This was the beginning of the break, and we both knew it. The barbecue that would eventually split my family wide open began the same way every summer gathering in Jacksonville did, with folding chairs sinking slightly into the soft grass, the sharp smell of charcoal drifting from the old grill, and the heavy warmth of a July afternoon pressing itself into every surface. Mom insisted on hosting it, even though she was still recovering, brushing off my concerns with the same gentle determination she had used my whole life. She wanted normalcy. She wanted laughter in the yard again. She wanted a peaceful holiday. And for her sake, I promised myself I would do whatever it took to keep the peace. I arrived early to help her set up and kept my uniform tucked away in the car. This wasn't the day to remind anyone who I was outside this house. This was her day, her pride, her attempt at stitching something broken back together. But peace is a delicate thing, especially when the wrong person feels threatened by it. Guests trickled in slowly, cousins, neighbors, Richard's old friends from his SEAL days. People brought potato salad, paper plates, pies from Publix, and the same predictable conversations. The moment Jake stepped into the yard, everything shifted. He carried himself the way he always did, like gravity bent around him. Tight t-shirt, protein shake in hand, fake humility on his face, but arrogance simmering underneath. He greeted relatives with loud enthusiasm, slapping backs, flexing subtly, positioning himself at the center of the gathering without anyone noticing how intentional it was. I kept my distance, refilling drinks and helping Mom carry trays. I could feel Jake watching me from across the yard, the way a dog watches another dog enter its territory. He waited until all the chairs were filled and the conversations were humming before he finally approached the center table, clearing his throat dramatically. Here we go, I thought. The performance. He raised his beer. To real discipline, he said loudly. To the people who put in the work every day. His friends cheered. A few relatives clapped politely. I stayed still, predicting the next beat of his monologue before it even came. Then he smirked. You know, some people wear a uniform and think it makes them military, but real service isn't pushing buttons or sitting in an office. Real service is sweat, strength, grit. He nodded toward me in a way so subtle most people wouldn't catch it. But I'd grown up reading the smallest flickers of his intent. Several aunts turned to look at me as if waiting for my reaction. Mom froze near the grill tongs halfway raised. Richard watched in silence, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Jake wasn't done. My sister flies a desk, he said, laughing as if it were harmless. The only danger she faces is a paper cut. A ripple of laughter moved through the tables, the kind that grows when people aren't brave enough to resist the current. I felt my jaw tighten, but kept my expression controlled. For my mother. For this day. For the version of family she kept trying to preserve. Jake leaned into his momentum. Some people just aren't built for the real stuff. Not everyone can handle actual military toughness. He puffed his chest slightly, like the caricature of a soldier he pretended to be. His friends nodded in admiration, validating his fantasy. Mom set down the plate of burgers with trembling hands. Honey, she called gently, her voice strained. Avery. Honey, come sit. I pretended not to hear the tremble. I walked toward the table and took a seat between two cousins who shifted awkwardly, unsure whether they should look at me or pretend they hadn't noticed anything. Jake saw the discomfort and mistook it for entertainment. He planted himself directly across from me, stretching out like he owned the yard. So tell us, Avery, he said, his tone syrupy sweet. What's it like being, what do you call it, administrative Air Force? More laughter. I felt the heat rise behind my ears, but kept my voice steady. I'm a pilot, Jake, he grinned wide. A pilot, sure. Simulator pilot, drone pilot, computer pilot? Which kind exactly? The mockery deepened. People leaned in. The air thickened with expectation. I swallowed the wave of anger, reminding myself why I'd come home. This wasn't worth ruining Mom's day. But Jake wasn't finished. He tapped his beer bottle against the table 3 times to get everyone's attention. You see, folks, he announced, my sister likes to pretend she's military. But we all know the real backbone of service is men who actually put in physical work. The whole table erupted in laughter as if he had just delivered a punchline worthy of a late-night show. Every chuckle felt like a nail driven deeper into something raw inside me. Mom opened her mouth to speak, but Jake cut her off. "Don't worry, Mom. She knows I'm just kidding." I wasn't sure if he believed that or if he simply needed to believe it to feel justified. I kept my eyes fixed on the table, breathing slowly, counting each inhale the way I had learned to steady myself before combat landings. If the world could see the contradiction, they would laugh for different reasons. The man who had never set foot in a combat zone mocking the woman who had flown through them. But no one here knew that. No one except one person. Richard sat with his arms locked tight across his chest, watching Jake with a tension in his jaw I had rarely seen. He said nothing. Not yet. Jake pressed on, sensing victory. "You all should see how seriously she takes it. She acts like she's done something heroic." It was the last sentence that finally cut through me. Not because of the words, but because of the truth behind them. I had risked my life for people who would never know my name. I had flown into gunfire to protect men who prayed for air support. I had once saved Richard's entire team. And here I sat letting his son humiliate me to keep a fragile peace. My mother's hand brushed my arm under the table. Her eyes pleaded silently. "Please don't start anything." I nodded once because this day wasn't about me. Not yet. I swallowed everything, every insult, every lie, every flicker of pain, and I kept quiet. But inside, something finally cracked. Something deep. Something old. Something that had been waiting years for its moment. The moment was coming, and Jake had no idea how close he was to setting it all on fire. I told myself I could endure the rest of the barbecue if I just stayed quiet a little longer. I had survived deployments near Mrs. Desert Nights filled with the sound of distant gunfire. Surely I could survive one more round of Jake's posturing. But cruelty, when layered over years, becomes something sharper than a single insult. It becomes a weight. It becomes gravity. And eventually, gravity pulls. I stood up from the table, intending to slip inside the house for a moment to breathe and gather myself before anyone noticed the heat rising beneath my skin. I barely made it 2 steps before a hand clamped around my wrist and yanked me backward. Jake! It happened so fast I didn't even register the motion until my body jerked to a stop, my wrist twisted in his grip. "Where are you going?" he demanded loudly, forcing a laugh that carried across the yard. "We're not done talking." The chairs scraped as a few relatives shifted to get a better look. Some smiled awkwardly. A couple laughed outright. To them, it was roughhousing. Sibling teasing. Normal. Harmless. They didn't see the tension in his jaw, the hard pressure of his thumb against my bone, the possessive way he anchored me in place like he had a right to keep me there. I tried to pull my arm back calmly, not wanting to escalate anything. Jake let out a mocking whistle. "Whoa there, Captain. Relax. I wasn't attacking you, just keeping you from running off again like you always do." My wrist throbbed. His grip tightened. He knew exactly what he was doing. And the worst part was the way everyone else looked away, pretending not to notice or pretending it was a joke, pretending it was anything except what it was. I said quietly, Jake let go. He laughed louder, lifting our joined hands dramatically as if we were about to perform some circus act. "You see, she gets all serious when she's embarrassed," he said to the crowd. "Don't worry, everyone, she's fine, just sensitive." Another round of laughter scattered through the tables. My mother's face paled, but she froze the way she had frozen my entire childhood, caught between the instinct to protect and the fear of disrupting the fragile balance. Richard watched from his seat under the palm tree, his eyes narrowing slightly, though he still didn't intervene. To everyone else, it was a harmless tug. To me, it was a different kind of battlefield, a memory in reverse. The same wrist I had used to pull the trigger that saved his father's life. The same wrist that had steadied the controls through enemy fire, and now it was locked in the grip of a man who had never once contributed anything but noise to the world. My voice dropped even lower. "Jake, let go of me." He leaned closer, his tone sharpening in a way only I could hear. "What are you gonna do?" Run crying to Mom. Run back to your base and pretend you matter. His breath hit my cheek. His fingers dug deeper into my skin. And in that second, I understood something that should have scared me more than it did. He wasn't holding me because he was joking. He was holding me because he needed control. He needed to remind me that in this yard, in this family, he believed he still had power. He believed he could still force me into the quiet girl who swallowed every insult. A few nearby relatives laughed again, nudging each other. He's just teasing her. Brothers and sisters, you know how it is. Except it wasn't teasing. And they didn't know how it was. My vision tightened. The buzzing of cicadas seemed to fade, and then something inside me clicked the same way it had the moment I heard a SEAL team screaming coordinates over an unstable radio line. I looked down at my wrist. The skin beneath his fingers was already flushed red. And in that simple image, I saw the truth. In this family, I was not protected. In this family, my pain was entertainment. In this family, my boundaries were negotiable if it meant keeping Jake comfortable. I felt a heat rise through me, not like panic, but like clarity. A sharp, cutting clarity that came from years of swallowing words that were finally too big to fit inside silence. I lifted my gaze slowly until my eyes locked with his. Something in my expression must have changed because the cocky grin on his face faltered for just a breath. Then I spoke with a steadiness that made the hairs on the back of my own neck stand up. Jake, let go. Now. The word now cracked through the tension like lightning. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was controlled, precise. A tone carved from every high-stakes mission I'd ever flown. He blinked at me surprised. His grip loosened, but not because he wanted to release me, because someone else had finally moved. A shadow shifted behind him, a chair scraped against the patio, and a voice I hadn't heard in that tone since Raka cut through the yard. "That's enough!" The sound of Richard's voice pulled every head in the yard toward him. Calm, commanding. A voice that didn't request anything. A voice that didn't negotiate. A voice that made even trained men straighten their backs. Jake stiffened. "Dad, we're just messing around." Richard stepped closer. His eyes didn't leave my wrist. His jaw was set in a line I recognized from years ago when he was Captain Mason and not just a quiet man in a backyard. I watched the realization ripple across Jake's face. For the first time, he seemed unsure. His fingers released me. Slowly, reluctantly, as if he still believed he deserved the final word. My wrist pulsed with returning blood flow. Red marks glowed against my skin like bruises waiting to bloom. No one laughed anymore. The yard fell silent except for the soft crackle of the grill. I stepped back a single pace, not out of fear, but out of something sharper. Something rising, something that had been building for years. That moment, the imprint of his fingers, the echo of the laughter, the red mark blooming like a warning flare burned itself into my memory. It was the moment I realized the truth I had been avoiding. This family did not protect me, not even when they saw harm happening in front of them. I let my arm fall to my side and said nothing, not yet. But deep inside, something shifted irrevocably. A pressure that had been building for years finally cracked open. The explosion was coming. Jake had just lit the fuse. The yard was still humming with the shock of Richard's intervention when the moment that would break 12 years of silence finally arrived. It didn't come with fireworks. It didn't come with shouting. It came quietly, almost accidentally, like truth often does when people have spent their entire lives running from it. After Jake released my wrist, the tension didn't dissolve, it condensed. It clung to the air like humidity, thick and silent. A few relatives murmured uneasy jokes to fill the space. Someone turned the grill down too low. A beer can hissed as it was opened somewhere behind me too loud in a yard that had gone too quiet. Richard didn't look at anyone, not at Jake, not at Mom, not at me. He only stared at the faint red marks around my wrist. His jaw clenched so tight, the muscles along his neck twitched. It was the first time I'd ever seen him look at me like that with recognition. with something bordering on fear and something else that looked suspiciously like guilt. And that was before he knew the whole truth. Jake tried to laugh the tension off, brushing imaginary dust off his shirt. "Guys, relax," he said, forcing a grin. "We're just playing around. She gets so dramatic sometimes." A few relatives chuckled, relieved he had given them a way to pretend nothing was wrong. Mom took a half step toward me, guilt flickering briefly across her face before she smoothed it away. It was the same expression she'd worn most of my childhood, torn between keeping peace and keeping truth. Richard took in every movement, every word, his expression unreadable. Jake kept talking, his voice rising again. "Avery's fine. She just doesn't know how to take a joke. She's military, but not like the real military." "You know," more laughter. Something inside me hardened. The weight of years of dismissal, of invisibility, of swallowed pain settled into a single sharp point inside my chest. I should have walked inside right then. I should have stepped away before the next spark. But something inside me refused to shrink again. I lifted my chin slightly, feeling the throb in my wrist, feeling the heat behind my eyes, feeling the truth rising like a tide. Jake smirked at my silence. "Come on, Avery, don't glare at me. What, I hit a nerve." His buddies snickered. He leaned back in his chair, throwing an arm over its back like he owned the yard, the house, the entire story. "We all know you're not like on the front lines or anything. You're basically Air Force admin with wings." It was the word admin that snapped something loose. Admin. As if the cockpit were a cubicle. As if 30mm rounds and ground fire were copy machines and staplers. As if Syria had been a slideshow presentation. Before I could stop myself, I said quietly, "But I've been there." Jake laughed. "Where?" "Florida." I held his gaze. "Syria." The laughter died immediately. It didn't drop off gradually, it died mid-breath. A hush fell across the tables, thick and palpable. Several relatives stared at me as if I'd suddenly spoken in a foreign language. One uncle blinked confused. Someone's fork dropped onto a plate. Jake scoffed, misunderstanding the silence. "Yeah, okay. Sure. Syria. You. Right." He snorted loudly. "Did you fly a drone, Avery, from like Nevada?" A few people chuckled nervously. Jake was gaining confidence again. He leaned forward. "Nobody believes you, you know." Mom squeezed her hands together nervously. Not harsh, just dismissive, hurtful in the way only soft disbelief can be. "Sweetheart," she murmured. "Maybe don't." I cut her off gently. I flew close air support. The backyard froze. Even the cicadas seemed to go quiet. Then Jake barked another laugh. "Close air support. You can't even—" That was when Richard moved. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just slowly, deliberately, his chair scraping against the concrete. Everyone turned. He walked toward the table with a heaviness that made every relative straighten in their seat. He stopped right beside Jake, hands clasped loosely behind his back, in a posture that looked almost like parade rest. His voice came out low, steady, and dangerous. "Avery, what's your call sign?" The question punched the breath straight out of me. For a second, I felt like I was back in the cockpit headset tight against my ears, the world spinning below me in the dark of the desert. No one at this table should have known to ask that question. Not unless they already knew the answer. Or unless the truth he'd been carrying for 5 years was about to rip itself open. I swallowed. My voice came out quiet but clear. Sundown. It was a name forged in fire, spoken over gunfire, echoed through a valley strewn with chaos. It was the last thing dozens of men had heard before the sky opened for them. It had been spoken in desperation, in hope, in survival. Richard froze. Not a muscle moved, not his breath, not his blinking, nothing. Jake actually glanced between us confused. The rest of the family sat in perfect stunned silence. Then Richard inhaled once sharply, the way someone does when a memory slams into them with full force. The way someone does when they realize a truth they buried is standing right in front of them. "Sundown," he whispered. His voice cracked. He looked at me, then really looked, and I saw every emotion he'd locked behind silence spill into his eyes all at once. Recognition, gratitude, shame. and something that looked painfully close to heartbreak. Jake opened his mouth to joke again, but Richard turned on him so fast the air seemed to shift. "Apologize. Now." The command detonated through the yard. No one had ever heard him use that tone outside a battlefield. Not even Jake. Not even me. Jake blinked. Dad Richard's voice cut like steel. "Now!" His jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists at his sides, and in that instant, the truth broke open in front of everyone. Richard didn't just know my call sign, he had known it for years. He knew exactly who Sundown was and exactly what I had done, and now everyone else understood that too. Jake's eyes darted between the two of us. "Dad, it was a joke. Apologize. Now." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order forged from a lifetime of command. No one disobeyed that voice. Even the birds perched on the fence seemed to go quiet. Jake's face flushed red with confusion and humiliation. "Dad, what is?" Richard finally looked at him, and when he spoke, his voice carried the truth he had buried since 2019. "She saved my men. She saved me. And you laughed at her." The yard erupted not with noise, but with silence so deep it pressed into the skin. Mom's hand covered her mouth. A cousin stiffened in her chair. One of Richard's old SEAL buddies muttered something under his breath, something that sounded like holy hell. Jake looked like the ground had been ripped out from under him. His bravado evaporated, his shoulders curled inward for the first time in his life. "Ed." "I didn't know," he whispered. His voice was small, pathetic. "I know," Richard said. "That's the problem." Jake turned to me, eyes wide, like he didn't recognize the person sitting across from him anymore. "Avery," he stammered. I didn't know. Everything I had buried, every ache I had swallowed, every moment I had been erased, it all rose to the surface. But when I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "It's fine." He shook his head desperately. "No. No, Avery, I didn't mean..." Richard stepped forward, cutting him off sharply. "You didn't ask. That's why you don't know. You've never asked about anyone but yourself." The words hit harder than the order to apologize. Jake's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His pride had been gut-punched in front of every person he cared about impressing, and I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph. Just clarity. This moment had never been about winning. It had been about truth. And truth had finally spoken for itself. Jake swallowed hard. His voice cracked. I'm sorry." The apology was thin, unsteady, shaken, not enough, not honest. But it was the only one he had. I nodded once, not in forgiveness, just acknowledgement. The silence held us all in place for several long seconds. The world felt suspended as if the air itself understood a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. Then, somewhere behind us, a firework cracked in the sky, bright and loud. It lit the yard for just an instant, a flash of red, white, and blue across the stunned faces of everyone present. And in that frozen burst of light, I realized something with sudden, crystalline clarity. This was the moment everything changed. This was the moment the family myth shattered. This was the moment Richard finally stopped choosing silence. And this was the moment Jake finally learned that the world was bigger than the spotlight he had built for himself. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt seen, truly seen, for the first time since childhood. And I knew the firestorm was only beginning. For a long second after Jake's apology, the backyard stood frozen in an uncomfortable stillness, as if every person was waiting for someone else to breathe first. People shifted in their chairs, but no one spoke. Even the kids who had been running near the fence slowed to a stop, sensing the crackle of tension in the air. Richard remained standing, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the son who had just embarrassed him in the most public way possible. But the shock that rippled through the crowd was aimed at me. At the quiet, polite, easily dismissed relative no one had taken seriously for more than a decade. And now, every pair of eyes rested on me with a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and a dawning realization that their assumptions had been wrong for years. A cousin finally whispered under her breath, though loud enough for half the yard to hear. "She saved you." Richard turned slowly toward the cluster of relatives, his expression shifting into something heavier, something that carried the weight of stories he had never intended to speak out loud. He cleared his throat once, as if preparing himself for the consequences of finally breaking his long-held silence. "What happened in Syria was not something I ever expected to talk about in a backyard," he said quietly. "But some things need to be said." Jake swallowed hard. Mom reached for her drink with trembling fingers. Relatives leaned in instinctively, as though drawn to the gravity of a truth that was too big for the patio lights and plastic tablecloths. Richard inhaled deeply before beginning. "It was late summer," he said. "August 2019. My team was pinned down outside a small valley west of the Euphrates. We had taken heavier fire than expected, lost comms. Night was falling and we were cut off from our extraction point." One of the SEAL veterans, who had been sitting on the far end of the yard, straightened in his seat, eyes narrowing as he recognized the rhythm of the story. Richard continued. "We called in for support, but the closest aircraft was too far out. They told us to hold. We couldn't. We were running out of time and ammunition." He paused. The memory clearly sat like a stone in his chest. Then a voice came over the radio, calm, steady, exactly when we needed it. "Sundown checking in." He turned toward me then, though he didn't fully meet my eyes, torn between pride and the shame of having hidden it for so long. She was the one who responded. A murmur rippled through the crowd. An aunt clapped a hand over her mouth. One of the neighbors whispered something like, "No way." Richard pressed on. She flew low enough to draw fire off our position, made herself a target so we could move. Jake's expression faltered completely. "You did that," he whispered, staring at me as though seeing me for the first time. I didn't answer. Richard did. "She saved my entire team. Without her, I wouldn't be standing here." His voice cracked mid-sentence, and he quickly swallowed hard, as if refusing to let emotion break the cadence of a story he had rehearsed only in the silence of his own conscience. For the first time since arriving at the barbecue, I felt every stare shift from curiosity to something heavier, something that felt strangely like reverence. But I didn't bask in it. I stood still, hands loosely clasped behind my back in the same posture I used during briefings, letting the moment come and go without claiming it. I didn't need their applause. I just needed the truth to exist out loud. Jake's face flushed a bright, humiliating red. His bravado melted into something closer to panic. "Dad, you never said that!" Richard looked at him with a mix of disappointment and resignation. "I didn't say a lot of things. That was the problem." A hush swept over this gathered family as the weight of that confession settled into the Florida heat. Mom rubbed her forehead, trembling ever so slightly. She whispered, "I had no idea." Richard shook his head. "None of you knew. That was on me. I thought staying quiet would keep things simple, protect everyone." His gaze drifted to me and settled there, but it only hurt the person who deserved recognition the most. His words dug painfully deep, though I kept my face steady expression neutral the way I had been trained. The silence in the yard stretched taut. A few relatives exchanged guilty glances. They had spent years laughing at Jake's loud stories about heroism and toughness and brute strength while quietly nodding along whenever he dismissed me as the soft one, the background one, the afterthought. And now they sat confronted with the truth that the quiet one had been the only real warrior among them, the one who had carried a burden too classified to share and too heavy to dismiss, the one who wasn't allowed to defend herself, the one they had failed to see. Richard exhaled slowly. Sundown was the only reason we made it back. She made passes so close to the ground I could feel the wind shift. She held the line for us until extraction. Then she vanished back into the sky. That was the day I understood what real courage looked like. Jake pressed both hands to the table, his voice barely audible. "And I called you a fake." He blinked hard. "I mocked you, demeaned you. I said you weren't real military." The shame in his voice was unmistakable, and for the first time in our lives, it wasn't followed by excuses or jokes or attempts to laugh it off. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably. One uncle muttered something about never judging a book by its cover. Someone near the grill whispered she did all that Avery really. Another murmured quietly, God bless her. Every set of eyes turned toward me, some wide with guilt, others wide with awe. But I didn't speak. I didn't nod. I didn't confirm or deny. I let Richard's words do what silence had failed to do for years. He addressed the group fully now, voice steady and resolute. I should have said this long ago. She deserves respect. She earned it. And every time Jake belittled her, every time any of you laughed along, it wasn't harmless. It was ignorance. My heart thumped once sharply against my ribs. The family shifted again, visibly uncomfortable, but not one person dared defend themselves. Jake leaned back in his chair as if the sheer weight of humiliation pressed on his spine. His hands shook, his jaw trembled. He looked like a man stripped of every illusion he had used to build his identity. Dad, he whispered, voice cracking. Why didn't you tell us? Richard inhaled deeply and answered with the truth I had waited years to hear, because I was ashamed that someone half your size had more courage than all of us combined. The yard went silent so completely that I could hear the distant hum of the neighbor's air conditioner turning on next door. Jake's mouth fell open. He looked shattered, defeated, humbled in a way I had never believed possible. Mom dabbed her eyes, though she tried to pretend it was just the smoke drifting from the grill. Cousins exchanged glances filled with remorse. And through all of it, I remained still rooted in the same calm that had guided me through the darkest nights of combat. I didn't need to prove anything. Not anymore. Richard stepped closer, his voice gentler now, but still carrying the weight of command. Avery, I am sorry. I should have spoken sooner. I nodded once, acknowledging the apology, though not taking it into my heart. Healing required more than words spoken under duress, but something in the yard shifted subtly, a kind of collective awakening, a recognition that the person they had all overlooked was the person who had lived the kind of bravery the rest of them only watched in movies or heard in second-hand stories passed around tables like myths. Jake struggled to find his voice. Avery, he whispered, I don't know how to. I held up one hand, stopping him calmly. You don't need to say anything right now. His breath hitched and something inside him broke fully as he realized he could no longer hide behind ego. His humiliation was complete, his pedestal destroyed. The breeze shifted, carrying the salty scent of the Atlantic over the yard, as though cleansing the space of years of silence and misunderstanding. And for the first time ever, the family looked at me not as the girl they could ignore, not as the polite one on the sidelines, not as the afterthought. They looked at me as the person who had done what none of them could have imagined, the person who had carried courage in silence because speaking it would have broken rules and broken hearts, the person who had flown through fire and come home alone, the person they had failed to see. And in that moment, the truth stood taller than any lie Jake had ever told. The entire backyard felt suspended in reverence and discomfort, all tangled together. And I finally understood something with piercing clarity. I had been invisible because they needed me to be invisible. The truth was too big, too inconvenient, too humbling. But now that truth stood in the open, unavoidable, unarguable, unforgettable, their eyes stayed on me, and the silence that followed was not the old silence that erased me. It was a new silence, the kind that rose when people finally saw something sacred, something powerful, something undeniable. And for the first time in years, the silence finally belonged to me. The moment Richard finished speaking, the yard didn't simply fall quiet. It collapsed into a stunned, heavy silence, the kind that makes people suddenly aware of their own heartbeat. Faces that only minutes earlier were lit with laughter now hovered somewhere between shame and disbelief. The breeze barely stirred. Even the sizzle from the grill seemed to fade, as if the world itself paused to absorb the truth that had finally been dragged into daylight. Jake sat frozen, shoulders curled inward, face pale beneath the Florida sun. His jaw flexed as though he were chewing on words that refused to come out. When he finally found his voice, it came out small, defensive, the old reflex kicking in. That's not true, he stammered, looking around desperately as if someone might save him from the weight of his own humiliation. Dad is exaggerating. He always does this. You all know he tells stories. A few relatives exchanged looks, but no one stepped in to rescue him. Not after what they had just heard. Not after seeing the look in Richard's eyes. Jake swallowed and kept going, voice trembling faster now. I mean, yes, sure, she flew her plane, but do we really know it was that big a deal? No one answered. The silence grew heavier, settling on his shoulders until he squirmed. He straightened and tried to laugh, but the sound cracked midway like breaking glass. Come on. You all know Avery. She is not some war hero. She's just... Richard snapped his head toward him so sharply Jake flinched. Finish that sentence, he warned, voice low like distant thunder. Go on, Jake. Tell everyone who she is. Jake's mouth hung open. Sweat formed at his temple. He tried again, reaching for the last scrap of pride he had left. She exaggerates things too, he said weakly. She always made herself seem like she was doing something big, when really she was just flying equipment around or something. The last word came out almost a whisper, or something. Richard stepped closer, gaze burning through him. She saved my men. He said it slowly, each word landing with the force of a hammer. She saved my men. Jake swallowed so hard his throat clicked. Dad, you don't know that, he whispered, though his voice had lost all conviction. Richard leaned in until they were nearly eye to eye. I was there. I know exactly what she did. I watched her fly lower than any pilot I have ever seen. I watched her hold the line when we thought we were dead, and you have spent years mocking her because you were too small to imagine a world where someone else outshined you. The words sliced something open inside Jake. His face reddened, his breath turned shallow. He shook his head violently as if trying to shake off the truth. This is ridiculous, he snapped, voice rising in a desperate attempt to reclaim power. Everyone is just overreacting. You're all taking her side because she earned it. Richard cut in. Something Jake never expected to hear voiced out loud, not even from the man he idolized. Jake froze. His bravado cracked all at once, splintering into 100 jagged pieces. The shift was so sudden the crowd actually gasped. He looked around wildly, eyes darting from face to face, searching for someone, anyone who would validate his version of reality. But no one could. Not after hearing what they heard. Not after seeing the look on Richard's face. Jake's voice pitched upward. You're choosing her over me, he whispered. His voice shook with a combination of disbelief and betrayal. Richard didn't back down. I'm choosing the truth. That's what men are supposed to do. Jake started breathing too fast, panic rising behind his eyes. He tried one last time to salvage himself. Fine, he said, voice trembling but louder. You want the truth? The truth is she's been acting superior since she joined the Air Force. She pretends she is so much better than the rest of us. Pretends she is some kind of hero. She is always so quiet, like she is above everyone. He pointed at me, jabbing a finger like a child cornered in a lie. She thinks she is better than family, better than me, better than all of us. His voice cracked fully now. She abandoned her family. She left us here while she chased her little job. She didn't even care Mom was sick. Mom gasped quietly but said nothing. Jake was unraveling and everyone saw it. She is not some saint. Jake continued his words, spilling over each other faster and louder. She is just... He reached for a word he had always used to make himself feel bigger, but now the word sounded childish, pathetic, weak. Just Avery, he finished, voice breaking. Just Avery. The yard stood completely still, waiting for Richard's response. But Avery's response, my response, was the one that broke the tension first. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I didn't justify. I simply said one sentence. I never needed to be better than you. I just needed to be myself. Jake blinked as if struck. The crowd murmured softly. The truth in that single line clung to the air like humidity. And that was when something inside Jake cracked so visibly that even the children stopped running to stare. His breathing turned ragged, His eyes went glassy. He looked at me with a mixture of fear, guilt, shame, and something darker, something bitter, something that had been building for years. Then he snapped. "You think you're so perfect," he shouted. "You think you're above consequences. You think you can embarrass me in front of everyone." "I didn't embarrass you," I answered quietly. "You did that yourself." A few relatives let out small, shocked breaths. Jake staggered backward, as though the statement had physically hit him, his face contorted in humiliation. Rage. And then something broke completely. He spun around, shoved past a table, nearly knocking over a plate of ribs, and stormed across the patio. His footsteps pounded the concrete. Someone called his name. He didn't turn. He slammed the side gate open so hard it rattled against the fence, bouncing once before clattering shut behind him. His car engine roared to life, and within seconds he peeled out of the driveway, leaving a trail of dust and silence behind him. No one spoke. The only sound was the ocean wind brushing against the palm trees. Richard stared after him, jaw-tight, eyes pained. Mom stared down at her drink, unable to lift her eyes. Relatives shifted uncomfortably, each feeling like they had just witnessed a man fall apart in the rawest, most unforgiving way. And me? I stood frozen for a beat longer than I meant to the weight of the entire moment pressing into my chest. I barely noticed when someone touched my shoulder asking if I was okay. I nodded politely, but the words didn't reach my ears. My pulse was too loud, my breath too tight. My wrist still throbbed with the fading imprint of Jake's fingers. I stepped back from the table. Then another step. The yard blurred around the edges like a photograph out of focus. Richard called my name quietly, but I couldn't answer him, not yet. I turned, walked toward the dunes, and slipped past them down onto the quiet edge of Atlantic Beach. The moment my feet hit sand, I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. The sky had begun deepening into sunset, streaked with orange and purple and muted gold. The waves lapped the shore with a rhythmic calm, entirely at odds with the storm inside me. I walked until the noise of the barbecue faded into nothing, until the air smelled of salt and freedom, until there was no audience, no expectations, no eyes weighing my worth. Barefoot in the cooling sand, I sank to my knees and covered my face with both hands. And for the first time in years, maybe the first time since Syria, I cried. Not the tight, controlled tears I had let slip in barracks bathrooms or in the cockpit when no one could see. These were deeper, heavier, carved from something older than combat and sharper than fear. They were the tears of a child who had learned to stay small, to stay quiet, to stay safe. Tears for every moment I had, disappeared myself so that others could shine. Tears for every time I had swallowed my own accomplishments so someone like Jake wouldn't feel threatened. Tears for the silence I had been forced to call peace. The waves washed closer, cool foam touching my knees, and as I cried, the sound of the water mixed with the ragged rhythm of my breath, blending into something strangely cleansing. I didn't cry because I wanted pity. I didn't cry because Jake hurt me. I cried because something inside me had finally broken free. I cried because the truth was finally out loud. I cried because I had survived everything silence had taken from me. And as the sky darkened and the moon rose over the water, I lifted my head, wiped my face, and inhaled deeply the steady ocean air. For the first time in my life, the tears didn't feel like weakness. They felt like release. They felt like the start of something new. The storm had finally broken. The tide was shifting. And I knew when I stood up from that sand, I would not be the same woman who knelt down. 2 weeks passed after the barbecue, and the house finally settled into something resembling routine, though the silence inside still felt heavier than the summer air pressing through the windows. Mom stayed mostly in the kitchen, moving quietly, as if afraid any sudden sound might shatter the fragile calm. Richard walked with the stiff posture of a man carrying guilt. He could not shake his eyes drawn often to the back door, as if expecting something or someone to step through it. As for me, I filled the days with long runs on the beach, early mornings spent stretching beneath the orange Florida sunrise, and evenings reviewing flight manuals just to settle my mind. But even with the ocean breeze brushing away old memories, I felt an ache that hovered beneath everything, an ache shaped like betrayal and truth finally spoken. I had not heard a word from Jake since he sped away from the barbecue tires screeching against pavement, though rumors floated through the family grapevine the way whispers always do. Some said he had been drinking more. Others said he had gotten into loud arguments at the gym. One cousin mentioned he had been suspended for an altercation. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want them. Then one humid Saturday afternoon, just as thunderheads began blooming on the horizon, there was a firm, uneven knock at the door. Mom looked up startled, glancing toward me with a mixture of hope and dread. Richard set his coffee mug down slowly, the ceramic tapping the table softly. I already knew who it was before I stood. Something in the air changed, the kind of shift you feel before a storm breaks. I walked to the door, opened it, and there he was. Jake stood on the porch wearing a wrinkled gym shirt and basketball shorts, the Florida sun harsh on his face, highlighting the shadows beneath his eyes. He looked thinner, like life had been grinding him down faster than he could recover. For a moment, we just stared at each other. His jaw clenched, then unclenched fingers twitching at his sides, as if unsure whether to shove his hands in his pockets or present them as proof he came in peace. "Avery," he finally muttered, voice low. "Can I come in?" I didn't answer, but stepped aside, letting him enter because I wasn't afraid of him anymore, and because part of me wanted to see what he had come to say. He walked to the middle of the living room, standing stiffly near the coffee table where Richard's old seal coin rested, a silent reminder of everything he had mocked. Richard didn't greet him. Mom wrung her hands nervously at the kitchen counter. Jake swallowed hard, then turned toward me. "Look," he began in that familiar tone of his, the one he used when trying to sound sincere without doing the internal work sincerity required. I came to apologize. I waited. He shifted from foot to foot, clearing his throat. "I shouldn't have yelled at the barbecue, or grabbed your wrist, or said you weren't real military." That last line came out more annoyed than remorseful, like he was reciting a list someone forced him to memorize. I didn't react even as he huffed and lifted his chin with that old defensive tilt. "But you have to admit, you could have said something sooner." I blinked slowly. "Said something about what?" He rolled his eyes. "About the Syria thing. About being some big war hero. You kept that secret like it was some kind of prize." My stomach tightened as I caught the shift. He wasn't apologizing. Not really. He was reframing, justifying, pulling the conversation toward the familiar center where he could stand tall again. "Avery," he continued, pushing his shoulders back, "I mean, you let me look stupid. You let everyone treat you like the soft one. You didn't have to hide everything and make me the bad guy." The room seemed to tilt. I had heard many versions of Jake's arrogance before, but this one was new. A twisted blend of guilt and self-preservation dressed up as an apology. He took a step closer, hands gesturing broadly as he built his case. "I'm saying sorry. I'm the one who came here. I'm the one trying. That has to count for something, right?" He looked at me with an expectation so familiar it almost felt nostalgic. For years, I had given him what he wanted. Affirmation, validation, forgiveness, anything that would keep peace in a house built on uneven ground. Not today. I spoke calmly, cutting through the tension with the precision of a scalpel. "Jake, you're not apologizing." His lips parted, but I wasn't finished. "You're explaining, defending, positioning yourself in the best light possible." He blinked, caught off guard. "That's not true," he protested, but the weakness in his voice betrayed him. I stepped forward just enough to force him to meet my eyes. "Real apologies acknowledge harm. They don't negotiate it away." He shook his head, laughing breathlessly. Okay, so I'm not perfect. But come on, Avery. You can let this go. Your family. And I'm your brother." "Stepbrother," I corrected evenly. His expression flickered. "You're doing this on purpose," he snapped. "You want to make me feel small." I took a slow breath. "You feel small because you are facing what you did not because I am doing anything to you." He looked like he'd been slapped. Silence stretched between us, heavy and electric. Then I said the sentence that finally shattered the fragile illusion he brought into the room. "I don't trust you anymore." The words hit him harder than any uniformed confrontation. Harder than Richard's command. Harder than being exposed in front of the entire family. Jake's breath hitched. His eyes darted around the room as though searching for someone to contradict me. Mom covered her mouth with both hands. Richard remained still, arms crossed, gaze steady, not stepping in to rescue his son. Jake shook his head incredulous. You don't mean that. I held his gaze. I do. You have spent years tearing me down, years mocking things you didn't understand, years treating me like a threat when I did nothing but stay quiet so you could feel big. And even now you came here to rebuild your image, not to repair the harm. His face contorted in disbelief, then anger, raw and bright, surged across it. Wow, he spat. So that's it. You think you're better than me now because Dad decided to tell some dramatic war story and make you the star. He jabbed a finger at me, chest rising and falling rapidly. You wanted this, he accused. You loved it when everyone looked at you like some hero. That's what this is about, right? He was unraveling again the way he had at the barbecue, ego ripping at the seams. I didn't raise my voice. Jake, this isn't about the barbecue. It's about years of mistreatment you pretended were jokes. He stepped back, shaking his head as if trying to shake the truth off like water. This is unbelievable. You're unbelievable. You think you're so righteous, so perfect, so untouchable. I took a breath, steady and calm. I think I am done. That was the moment the shift happened. The moment he realized nothing he said would pull me back into the familiar cycle of guilt and appeasement. His face twisted with something almost childlike. Fear or desperation or both. No, you don't just end things like this, he said, voice shaking. You don't get to walk away from family. You don't get to just cut me out. I didn't waver. I just did. He stared at me, stunned. Then rage filled the empty space inside him faster than breath. His hands curled into fists, not to strike but to control the shaking building inside. Fine, he shouted, stepping backward. Have it your way. He spun toward the front door, stomped across the living room, and with all the immature fury of a man who had never learned consequences, he slammed the door so hard the walls vibrated. The picture frames rattled. A cup on the counter tipped over. Mom flinched. Richard closed his eyes for a brief, painful moment. And outside, tires screeched again. The storm inside him had not calmed. It had only been displaced back into the world. I stared at the door long after he was gone, feeling strangely empty and strangely relieved at the same time. The kind of relief that came not from victory, but from choosing myself for the first time. Richard spoke quietly, breaking the silence. You did the right thing. I nodded, though my chest ached. Actions have consequences. He continued, voice tight and tired. He will feel them. And he did. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a message from a cousin. Just saw something online. Call me. My stomach tightened. I called. The voice on the other end was shaken. Jake got into a fight at the gym. Bad one. Police were called. They have video. The consequences had arrived. Not because I wished them. Not because I demanded them. But because truth eventually demands its own justice. And Jake had finally run out of places to hide. The news about Jake spread through the family faster than summer storms roll across the Jacksonville coast. By the next morning, everyone had heard a version of what happened at the gym, though most of them whispered it like they were afraid speaking it too clearly might make the truth heavier. Some said he threw the first punch. Others said he shoved a new trainee into a rack of weights. One cousin claimed Jake had been screaming something about respect and betrayal before the fight broke out. But the one detail that no version could avoid was the one that mattered most. The entire incident was caught on camera. That fact alone was enough to send a ripple of shock through relatives who had spent years defending him against common sense. Evidence changed everything. Evidence stripped excuses down to bone. Evidence didn't care about someone's charm or their talent for spinning stories that made them look better than they were. By early afternoon, Richard came home from running errands, his face pale and stiff like a man bracing against a blow he knew he deserved. He set his keys on the counter with a soft clatter, then turned toward me where I sat at the dining table reviewing maintenance notes for the A-10's avionics systems. He cleared his throat but didn't speak right away. Instead, he lowered himself into the chair across from me, hands clasped together as if he were preparing for a briefing he couldn't escape. They called me, he said finally, voice quiet. His CO, I asked. The gym owner. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. They forwarded the footage. My chest tightened, not out of fear, out of the strange ache that comes from watching someone else's downfall when you spent years warning them the road they walked was unstable. What happened? I asked calmly. He got into an argument with a client, Richard said, rubbing his forehead. The man was new, maybe early 20s. Tried to adjust a machine. Jake said something to him, the other man replied, and Jake snapped. Snapped. The word hung between us with a weight that suggested this wasn't a sudden break, but the inevitable collapse of something that had been cracking long before the gym walls saw it. Richard shook his head. He shoved the kid into a metal rack, punched him twice before others pulled him off. My jaw tightened. Is the man okay? He's bruised, shaken, might press charges. My stomach dropped, though, not because of sympathy for Jake's consequences. It was the realization that we were now past the point of familial embarrassment. We were in real-world repercussions. Legal ones, social ones, ones Jake could not charm or yell his way out of. Richard rubbed his palms together, the sound harsh in the quiet room. The detectives will want statements from the gym staff tomorrow. I nodded. And Jake? I asked softly. He's refusing to talk to anyone, not answering his phone. He stormed out of the station after they questioned him and nearly shoved a deputy on his way out. My chest tightened again. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't even angry anymore. Just tired. Richard looked at me, then eyes filled with something older than guilt, something closer to regret. I should have taught him better, he murmured, years ago. Mom entered the room at that moment, wiping her hands on a towel, her face pale with quiet worry. She didn't ask what happened. She already knew. News like this never needed repeating. Richard reached for her hand gently, but his eyes stayed on me. He said softly, "There's something I told him today that I should have told him years ago." I lifted a brow, waiting. That actions have consequences. That no one is owed forgiveness because they want it. That respect is earned, not demanded. His voice hardened. And that he needs to learn responsibility. A long silence stretched between us. It wasn't tense. It wasn't cold. It was clearing like air after lightning. What did he say to that, I asked. Richard let out a humorless laugh. He said it was unfair, that the whole world is against him, that I'm choosing you over him. I held his gaze. And are you? He inhaled slowly. I'm choosing the truth, he said firmly. And I should have chosen it a long time ago. Mom placed a soft hand on his shoulder. Her eyes were glassy. She whispered, "Avery, I'm sorry for everything you carried alone." Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. I saw something in her expression, something I had wanted to see my entire life. Recognition. I nodded once, a small acceptance, a small step. The weight inside me shifted a little lighter. Not fixed, not healed, but acknowledged. Richard exhaled a long breath before standing. He walked toward the sliding glass door, staring out at the backyard where everything had exploded 2 weeks earlier. Then he spoke quietly, voice tinged with a truth that rang deeper than the moment itself. We protected the wrong person for too long. Mom flinched softly but nodded. I felt something tighten in my chest again, but this time it wasn't pain. It was clarity, the kind that settles after storms when the air finally feels breathable, the kind that tells you what comes next is yours to choose. That evening, the gym footage circulated, though only among the people involved. I watched it once because I needed to see it with my own eyes before deciding what silence would look like this time. The video held no ambiguity. Jake's posture radiated aggression. His shout was clearly audible. "You think you're better than me?" The crack of impact echoed sharp and cold. Staff members pulled him off as he fought against them, eyes wild, voice hoarse with fury. It didn't take an investigator to see the truth. Rage had been festering, and now it was spilling. I set the phone down, pressing my fingers to my temples, breathing slowly through the dull ache forming behind my eyes. Richard stood in the doorway watching me. "You don't need to see that," he said. I shook my head. I needed to know. He stepped closer. You don't have to be involved in this. They might ask questions about the barbecue, about his behavior, about what led up to this. I met his eyes. And do they need my input? Richard hesitated. No, he admitted carefully. The evidence speaks for itself. Good, I said, because I'm choosing silence. His brow furrowed. You shouldn't have to protect him. I'm not protecting him. My voice softened. I'm protecting myself. Silence used to be something forced on me, something that kept me small, something that cost me pieces of myself I should never have had to sacrifice. But now, silence felt different. Now it wasn't fear. It wasn't surrender. It was choice. It was a boundary. It was justice. Let the footage speak. Let his actions stand. Let the truth unfold without me being dragged into the emotional wreckage he created. Silence was not my cage anymore. It was my shield. Richard nodded slowly as understanding settled into his features. That's fair. He stepped back, hands resting loosely on his hips, shoulders heavy but relieved. You know he'll face consequences. I know, and he'll have to face them without you or me covering for him. I nodded. Good. For a long moment we stood in the warm glow of the living room lights, shadows stretching across the floor as the sun dipped below the horizon. Mom wiped a tear quietly. Richard rested a hand on her back, and for the first time in years I felt the house shift. Not physically, emotionally. The center of gravity changed. The truth finally belonged in the open air, not buried in old habits or family myths. That night, as I sat on the porch listening to distant thunder roll across the beach, I felt something rare and unfamiliar settle inside me. Peace. Not complete peace. Not permanent peace. But the kind of peace that comes when you stop carrying what was never yours to hold. The consequences were finally his. Not mine. Not anymore. The orders came in early spring of 2025. Crisp, formal, and unexpected. A thick envelope stamped with the crest of the Department of the Navy and the Department of the Air Force, together an emblem rarely seen on the same header. I opened it at the kitchen table, sunlight slanting through the blinds as the words slowly assembled their meaning. I had been selected to receive the Navy Air Force Joint Valor Medal, an award created only for the rarest of cross-branch actions where lives were saved under extraordinary circumstances. The letter stated that my performance during the Syria mission, the same mission Richard had spoken about at the barbecue, had been reviewed by a joint board. My radio coordination, my low approach maneuvers, my refusal to abandon the SEAL team, even when fuel ran low, all of it had been verified through mission logs and declassified summaries. For the first time, the truth would not just be known. It would be recorded. A ceremony would be held at Pensacola Naval Air Station, and attendance was encouraged for immediate family. The moment I finished reading the letter, I felt something shift inside me. Not pride exactly, but a release like a long-locked door creaking open under its own weight. When I told Richard, he froze, eyes widening with something between awe and dread. He sat heavily at the table, exhaling slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have been the one to nominate you years ago. Mom placed a hand over her mouth. Tears already building, but this time they weren't tears of confusion or fear. They were tears of understanding. Real understanding. The ceremony was scheduled for mid-May when the Florida heat was already climbing, yet the breeze from the Gulf kept the air soft and alive. I arrived at Pensacola NAS in full dress uniform, the blue fabric crisp the medals I had earned before today gleaming quietly over my chest. The base buzzed with activity sailors and airmen moving with purposeful precision. Rows of chairs had been set on the tarmac, facing a stage draped with flags that fluttered lightly in the salty wind. Veterans from multiple branches filled the seats, their hats marked with worn embroidery, MOS codes, deployments campaigns, and dates that spanned decades of American military history. And then I saw them. My family. Mom stood in a simple dress, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her eyes glistened when she saw me, and for the first time in my life, the look she wore was not worry or apology or fear. It was pride. Unfiltered pride. My breath caught. Beside her stood Richard in his old SEAL uniform, slightly faded but still carrying the unmistakable gravity of a man who had lived through the kinds of things most people only read about. His ribbons were worn, his insignia aged, but the posture remained the same, straight, controlled, commanding. I had never seen him wear it outside of a funeral or an official SEAL gathering. The gesture alone hit harder than any speech. Jake was not there. I didn't expect him to be. The crowd quieted as an officer stepped to the podium, his voice booming across the tarmac. Today we gather to honor Captain Avery Lockridge, United States Air Force, a 10 pilot for extraordinary valor in joint operations. The words hung in the air, heavy and resonant. A ripple of murmurs passed through the audience. The officer continued describing the mission in careful, non-classified detail. The SEAL team cut off in hostile terrain, communications failing, the approach corridor too narrow for safe engagement, enemy fire dense enough to shatter any pilot's nerve, and then a voice over the radio volunteering to attempt the impossible. Sundown checking in. I felt my pulse thrum at the memory. The officer explained how I had flown below recommended altitude to divert fire, how I had coordinated air support, how I stayed on station far longer than advised, ensuring the SEAL team reached extraction. He finished with the line that had followed me like a shadow ever since that night in Syria. She refused to leave until the last man was safe. The applause erupted instantly, rising across the tarmac like a wave hitting shore. Veterans stood. Active duty personnel stood. Even the officers on the stage straightened with visible respect. My stomach tightened, not with nerves, but with something deeper, something I had never allowed myself to feel fully recognized worth. Then came the moment. The officer turned toward me. Captain Lockridge front and center. I stepped forward, marching with the steady, even pace drilled into me since basic training. The medal was presented, a heavy polished emblem on a ribbon of deep Navy and Air Force blue. He placed it around my neck, then saluted crisp, sharp, precise. I returned the salute, meeting his gaze through the Florida sunlight. And then, as I stepped back, Richard rose from his seat. Slowly. Deliberately, standing tall like the officer he once was. The sight hit me in the chest with the force of a shockwave. He lifted his hand to his brow and saluted me, full, formal, unwavering, a gesture he had not given me at the barbecue or during the years before, a gesture he had never given me in my entire life. The yard confrontation had been loud and painful and raw. But this moment on the tarmac was silent and devastating in an entirely different way. It was reverence. It was apology. It was acknowledgement. It was everything he should have said years earlier but didn't know how. My throat tightened. Without hesitation, I returned the salute matching his precision. And that was when something extraordinary happened. The veterans in the crowd stood one by one, like ripples in a pond. Men from Vietnam Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan sailors, Marines, soldiers, pilots. They rose to their feet in lines and clusters, shoulders squared, backs, straight hands raised in solemn salute. Some had tears in their eyes. Some pressed their lips together to keep them from trembling. Some bowed their heads with quiet gratitude. To them, my call sign wasn't just a nickname. It was a symbol, a memory. A reminder that sometimes the quiet ones carry the heaviest weight. Mom began crying openly, a hand pressed to her heart. Richard's eyes glistened despite the rigid line of his mouth. Even the officers on stage paused for a moment, acknowledging the magnitude of what was happening. And then I saw movement to the left, a small group of my extended family cousins, uncles, distant relatives who had once believed every exaggerated story Jake ever told. They stood now, too solemnly, quietly moved by something they could no longer deny. The truth had finally outrun every lie. When the ceremony ended, people approached me, offering handshakes, embraces, quiet words that somehow carried more weight than applause. "You saved brothers," one man said, gripping my hand tightly. "Thank you for bringing them home," another veteran whispered. "I wish my daughter could meet you. She thinks bravery looks a certain way. She needs to see this." Their words were humbling, immense, overwhelming, but nothing compared to what happened when Richard approached me. He walked slowly, his old knee stiff, his breath steady but emotional. He took off his seal cap and held it in his hands, turning at once as though gathering courage. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "You make the uniform look better than I ever did." I exhaled a sharp breath, laughter tangled with tenderness. "Don't exaggerate, Captain." The corner of his mouth twitched, but he shook his head. "I mean it, Avery. Every word." He glanced away for a second, eyes glistening in the bright Florida light, then met mine again with a steadiness I had never seen from him. "I am proud of you." The words landed differently than any compliment I had ever received, not because of who said them, but because of how long they had been withheld. For a moment, the world around us blurred into sound and sunlight and weight. The truth had finally reached the surface, the part of the truth that didn't need an audience or a stage. It was personal, it was overdue, and it was real. When the crowd began dispersing, I saw my mother lingering near the edge of the tarmac, watching me with an expression I had spent a lifetime longing for. She crossed the distance slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for my face, brushing a thumb along my cheek. "I never knew," she whispered, voice breaking. "I never understood what you carried, but I do now, and I am so proud of you, my girl." I felt my chest tighten in a way that wasn't pain. It was release, pure release. Behind her stood the rest of the family, looking at me not as the quiet one, or the polite one, or the afterthought, but as the person I had always been and they had never taken the time to see. For years, the truth had been buried beneath assumptions and dismissal and the loudness of people who never earned the pedestal they stood on. Today, the truth didn't just rise. It stood on a platform in front of hundreds and shined. And no one, not Jake, not silence, not time, could bury it again. In that moment on the Pensacola tarmac beneath the blue-white Florida sky, I understood something with absolute clarity. Recognition wasn't the victory. The victory was that I no longer needed it to know who I was. But the world finally seeing me, that was the part I would never forget. The weeks after the ceremony at Pensacola NAS felt like stepping into a version of my life I had never imagined possible, one where the truth did not hide in shadows and the weight I carried alone for so long finally loosened its grip. When we returned to Jacksonville, the first sign of change came quietly, not with celebration or speeches, but with my mother standing in the living room holding a framed photo printed from the ceremony. In the picture, I stood at attention on the tarmac, the joint metal glinting against my uniform, sunlight blazing behind me. Richard stood in the background, saluting, his expression one of fierce, unmistakable pride. Mom held the frame like it was something sacred, her hands trembling slightly. "Shall we put it here?" she whispered, gesturing to the wall above the mantel, a spot reserved for family milestones, weddings, graduations, and a faded picture of Jake holding his first weightlifting trophy. For a moment, her voice wavered with something between joy and regret, as if she were making up for years that could never be rewritten. I nodded, unsure if my voice would come out steady if I tried to speak. Richard stepped beside her, lifting the hammer with quiet determination, and in 2 precise taps the picture hung, centered, framed by soft morning light. The sight of it made something deep in my chest shift, a knot loosening that I hadn't realized was still tied. It wasn't about pride. It was placement. It was acknowledgement. It was proof that for the first time in my life, I existed fully inside this home, not as a shadow, not as background noise, not as someone they apologized for, but as someone they could finally see clearly. Mom wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, then reached out and touched the frame, fingertips lingering on the metal in the picture. "My girl," she whispered, voice cracking. "My daughter." The words landed with a softness that almost broke me. In the days that followed, the shift in the house grew even more pronounced. Mom stopped walking on eggshells around the subject of my service. She asked questions, real questions about the aircraft, the missions, the camaraderie, the fear, the resilience. She listened with a genuine curiosity she had never allowed herself before. Richard began watching the local news with me, commenting on policy changes in the military, offering insight into things he once kept silent about. It felt strange, but healing, like finding pieces of a puzzle that were always nearby but never fit into place until now. And then there was Jake. News of his mandatory anger management courses spread through the family slowly and quietly, delivered in hushed tones over coffee or phone calls. According to the court order, he was required to attend weekly sessions as well as complete a set number of community service hours with a veterans outreach program, an irony so sharp it could have drawn blood. At first, he resisted. He missed classes brooded in corners, snapped at anyone who mentioned responsibility. But the world had stopped bending around his impulses. He no longer had people to blame except himself. That truth settled over him like storm clouds refusing to pass. One Saturday afternoon, I ran into one of his gym acquaintances at the grocery store. The man recognized my uniform shirt's embroidered name tag and approached hesitantly. "You're Avery, right?" he asked. "Lockridge?" "Yes." He shook his head softly. "He's different now. Not better. Not yet. But quieter. More careful. Like someone finally held up a mirror and he didn't like what he saw." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The consequences were unfolding exactly as they needed to. No interference from me, no guilt, no burden. Just reality doing what reality does. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the marsh, casting long golden streaks across the living room, Richard entered carrying the mail. A white envelope sat on top, bearing my rank in formal print. He handed it to me with a small, proud smile. "For you, Captain," he said, emphasizing the word with deliberate respect. Hearing it from him still startled me each time, as if it reshaped the air around us. I opened the envelope, revealing a formal request for me to speak at Pensacola, NAS for a joint training symposium, not about the classified details, but about leadership under pressure and cross-branch coordination. Me. The girl who grew up being talked over, cut off, dismissed unseen, now invited to stand before officers and enlisted personnel and teach. Richard sat down across from me, eyes shining with quiet pride. "They chose you because you earned it," he said. "Not because of the medal, because of who you are." Mom leaned against the doorway, smiling through soft eyes. "Captain Lockridge," she said more clearly than she ever had. It wasn't forced. It wasn't out of formality. It was recognition. And I felt something inside me settle. A wound long ignored, finally stitching closed. That night, we had dinner together in a way that almost felt like a new tradition forming. No raised voices. No tension hiding beneath polite conversation. No walking on old fractures. Instead, Mom asked about the symposium, her voice filled with the kind of admiration she once reserved only for Jake. Richard shared stories from his deployment days, careful to avoid sensitive details, but open in a way he had never been before. He spoke not like a commander, but like a man who had finally accepted he was allowed to be vulnerable without losing authority. And I listened, not because I needed validation, but because for the first time I wanted connection with them, not as the quiet child, but as the woman I had become. Days rolled into weeks, and the photograph of the Pensacola ceremony remained on the wall, a silent reminder of everything we had survived as a family and everything we were becoming. Visitors noticed it immediately. Some paused to take it in. Others commented on the uniform, the medal, the saluting veteran behind me. Mom never downplayed it. She never redirected the conversation to Jake or minimized my achievement the way she once would have. She stood a little straighter, speaking my rank with the same pride other mothers used for doctors or CEOs. It wasn't about military prestige. It was about seeing me, truly seeing me. One Sunday afternoon, as we prepared to leave for lunch, a knock came at the door. Soft, hesitant, almost reluctant. Richard answered, and there stood Jake, dressed in a plain shirt and jeans, hands tucked awkwardly into his pockets. His eyes flickered toward the wall where my photo hung, and he froze for half a second. Something in his expression shifted, a mix of humility, regret, and a heaviness that looked like acceptance. He didn't step inside. He didn't ask to. He just nodded once in my direction and said quietly, "I heard they're calling you Captain Lockridge now." The old Jake would have said it with sarcasm, or jealousy, or challenge. But this version said it with something quieter, something real. I nodded. "They are." He swallowed hard. "Well, good. You earned it." It was not forgiveness. It was not redemption. It was acknowledgement. And sometimes acknowledgement is the only bridge two people can stand on when trust has been washed away. He stepped back, turned, and walked to his car. No drama, no excuses, no anger. Just a man beginning to carry the weight of his own choices. As his engine faded into the distance, I let out a slow breath, feeling something loosen inside me. It wasn't peace with him. Not yet. Maybe not ever, but it was peace around him. And that was enough. That evening, as the sky softened into watercolor blues, Mom looked at me and asked the question she had never asked before. "How does it feel, Captain?" My chest warmed. "Like a new beginning," I said. And as I looked around the living room, framed by the photograph of the woman I had fought so hard to become, I realized it was true. This was a new era. Not because the family had changed overnight, but because I had. They no longer defined my worth. They simply recognized it. And that recognition reshaped everything. Atlantic Beach looked different in the late evening light, softer somehow, as if the coastline itself understood I had come seeking something I had chased most of my life. The sand was cool beneath my boots, the breeze brushing past me with the scent of salt and distant storms drifting somewhere over the horizon. I walked slowly, letting the weight of the day, the year, the decade settle behind me like footprints fading with each step. The shoreline stretched endlessly ahead, the waves rolling and steady and rhythmic, whispering their quiet songs the way they always had when I needed the world to stop long enough for me to breathe. I paused near the edge where the surf reached for my feet, gentle and insistent, and let my gaze drift toward the water where the last light of the sun shimmered across the surface like fragments of a path leading outward into a place untouched by pain. This beach had been witness to so many versions of me, the girl who ran from home to escape the suffocating smallness of a family that never understood the woman who returned from deployments carrying memories she could never fully speak, the daughter who stood invisible in her own house, the pilot who flew into chaos with a steady hand and a heart trained for storms. And now, the woman standing here was none of those entirely and all of them at once. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the wind wrap around me, the kind of wind that had rattled the wings of my A-10 flown beneath my cockpit at impossible altitudes, carried the dust and heat of distant battles. When I opened them again, the sky had darkened into a deep, bruised blue, streaked with fading gold and pale lavender, a quiet reminder that endings and beginnings often shared the same light. Behind me, the world I had spent so long trying to survive had shifted. My mother finally saw me. Richard finally honored me. The family finally acknowledged the truth they had spent years ignoring. In Jake, well, his world had cracked open, and he was learning to walk without the scaffolding of arrogance he had clung to his whole life. I felt no triumph in that, only an odd, calm acceptance that people break differently, some loud, some quietly, some slowly over time. The consequences he faced now were his to carry, not mine to shield him from. For the first time, the burden that had defined so much of my life no longer belonged on my shoulders. I stepped further onto the wet sand, letting the tide wash over the tips of my boots, feeling the coolness sink into me like the first breath after a long dive. It struck me that silence had always been my refuge, my weapon, my shield, the only thing I had full control over. But it had also been my prison. A place where I hid because speaking the truth felt like lighting a match inside a room soaked in gasoline. When I stayed quiet, people assumed I had nothing to say. When I stayed quiet, they assumed I deserved to be talked over. When I stayed quiet, they believed their version of me was accurate. That was the silence I had lived in for years, the silence of survival. But this silence now, this soft evening hush, broken only by waves and wind, felt entirely different. It wasn't the silence of being unheard. It wasn't the silence of being pushed aside. It wasn't the silence forced on children who learned early that making themselves small was the safest way to exist. No, this silence belonged to me, created by choice, not fear, protected by autonomy, not isolation. I breathed deeply, letting that new truth fill my lungs. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't need to check it to know it was probably another message from relatives awkwardly trying to rebuild bridges they had burned with years of dismissal, or maybe a quiet update from Richard about Jake's progress in anger management, or maybe even a distant colleague congratulating me again for the medal ceremony at Pensacola. I didn't take it out. Tonight, the world could wait. I walked further until the water brushed against my ankles, soaking into the hem of my pants, grounding me in the moment, in this place where I could finally feel the shift inside me settling into place. The memories of Syria drifted through me not with the sharp edges they once held, but softened slightly, as if distance and truth had dulled their bite. I could still hear the static of the radio, the frantic voices, the crack of fire lighting up the ground below. I could still feel the trembling of the aircraft when I pushed it to limits that would have terrified anyone else. I could still hear the breath I took when the team finally reached the extraction zone, and I whispered into the mic, "I've got you." Hold on. Memories like these never left. They lived inside the bones. But tonight, they didn't hurt. They simply existed. I tilted my head back, letting the wind blow my hair away from my face as the last sliver of sun dipped below the water. The horizon glowed for a moment like a burning line marking the end of a chapter etched so deeply into me that I could feel its shape even with my eyes closed. Behind me, I could faintly hear laughter drifting from the boardwalk, families enjoying their evening unaware of the quiet transformation happening only a few yards away. The world kept moving. It always would. But for the first time, I felt myself moving with it instead of against it. My mind drifted to the photograph hanging in the living room, the one my mother placed on the wall without hesitation. There was something powerful in that simple act of placing my image alongside family history, rewriting my place in it without needing permission from anyone else. I thought about the veterans who saluted me at the ceremony, the way their eyes held stories of their own losses and bravery, the way they recognized mine without needing explanation. I thought about Richard standing tall, saluting me with reverence. Not hierarchy, a gesture that told me without words that he finally saw me not as a stepdaughter, not as a quiet presence, but as someone who had carried more courage than he ever realized. I thought about Jake, not with bitterness, but with a strange, uncompromising clarity. Some people grow only when the ground beneath them finally cracks. And maybe he was beginning to see the shards for what they were. Maybe not. That part of the story wasn't mine to write. What mattered was that I had finally put down the weight he had pushed onto me for years. The tide rolled higher, lapping up around my calves, cool and insistent, as if urging me to step further into this moment, into this new chapter. So I did. I stepped deeper, letting the water swirl around me, the soft roar of waves blending with the faint hum of my heartbeat until they became indistinguishable. I closed my eyes again, letting everything settle inside me, the past, the pain, the recognition, the release. I felt the storms I had carried for years finally begin to quiet, replaced with something steadier, something like confidence, something like belonging, something like freedom. When I opened my eyes again, the horizon stretched wide open the way it always had, but tonight I finally felt capable of stepping into it without the weight of silence pulling me down. The wind picked up, brushing against my face gently, and I realized with a soft, startling clarity that I wasn't mourning anymore. I wasn't fighting to be seen. I wasn't begging anyone to understand. The girl who once whispered her worth into the dark now stood in the open air, unafraid of her own voice. I whispered to the waves, though no one was close enough to hear except the ocean itself. I made it, not because I had survived, but because I had finally chosen myself. A soft peace spread across my chest, the kind of peace that settled not because life had become perfect, but because I had stopped expecting others to give me what I had learned to give myself. The sky darkened fully now, a blanket of deep indigo dotted with emerging stars. The moon rose slowly, casting a silver trail across the water like a runway leading into night. I followed the shimmer with my eyes, imagining the familiar hum of engines, the way the plane would vibrate beneath my hands, the surge of adrenaline and purpose as the ground fell away. Flying had always been freedom to me, even before I understood what captivity felt like. When I finally turned to leave the beach, heading back toward the dunes, toward the road, toward whatever waited for me beyond this chapter, I paused one last time to take it in the way the coastline breathed, the way the sky stretched endlessly, the way the future no longer felt like a thing I needed permission to walk toward. I whispered the final words softly, letting them blend into the wind, the waves, the darkening sky. I have flown through dead zones, but for the first time in my life, I see the sky truly belongs to me. Have you ever been silenced by the very people who were supposed to protect you, the ones who should have lifted you up but instead pushed you deeper into the shadows? Maybe it was a parent who dismissed your pain with a quick wave of the hand, or a sibling who joked at your expense until you forgot what it felt like to stand tall, or a partner who convinced you that quiet was safer than truth. Maybe your silence wasn't a choice. Maybe it was survival. And maybe somewhere along the way, you wondered if you were the only one carrying that weight, the only one who swallowed your own voice just to keep peace in a room that never cared about your comfort. If that is you, then hear me now. You are not alone. You are not invisible. You are not overreacting. Sometimes the deepest wounds come not from strangers, but from the people who share our last names, our dinner tables, our memories from childhood. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do, the strongest thing you can do, is to take back the silence that once held you hostage and turn it into something you choose, instead of something you were forced into. Maybe you are still living in that silence, trying to decide whether your truth is worth speaking out loud, or maybe you already found the strength to break free and walk toward something better, something cleaner, something that doesn't crush you from the inside. Wherever you are on that path, your story matters. Someone out there, somewhere scrolling past this very moment might need to hear it. Someone might need to know that courage doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it comes in quiet, steady breaths. Sometimes it comes in the whisper that says enough. Sometimes it comes in the decision to stop carrying what was never yours to hold. If you feel comfortable, share your story below. You never know who might read it and realize they are not as alone as they thought. You never know who might find the strength to take their first breath of freedom because they saw that you survived too. Someone reading your words today may need your courage.